I believe I figured out why so many people, why everyone hates Black and African people, like why there is such animosity towards our community across the world, whether you're in Europe, South America, Asia. For some reason, people have a problem. And I think that I figured it out. Now, sorry, I'm taking a walk on the beach front, so it's a little bit noisy because of the waves, but hopefully you can hear me. But the thoughts came to me and I wanted to document this as it was coming into my mind. So I didn't want to wait till I got back to the studio or anything like that to talk about this. But anyway, I'm going to tell you a story that illustrates this. So recently, I have a platform that is all about African current affairs, African history, and all of those things. Like that's what I really focus on, is African history and politics and current affairs, and really trying to build a bridge between Africa and the diaspora. So, you know, we've only been around for a couple of years, and we've grown exponentially. So in the last few months, we've gained maybe, like I said, 70 to 80,000, no, not even the last few months, last 5 weeks, 70 to 80,000 subscribers, almost 80,000 subscribers in the last few weeks. And with that, I saw a change in the sort of comments that I was getting, which highlights exactly what I'm talking about here. So I started a lot more about African history. And when I say African history, I'm talking about the hidden aspects of African history. You know, the concept of the, you know, obviously I did the true origin of Nigeria before, I did the true name of Africa, did the true size of Africa. And I started doing things like the first kingdom, the true queens of Africa, you know, the origin of time, the origin of Egypt, the true origin of Egypt. And then I started seeing these comments from people that aren't even from the, sorry guys, I had a little glitch there. So back to what I was saying. So I started seeing a lot of these comments that were coming up on my channel from people who seemed really angry that I was posting these materials or this information. And the people who were angry were like, you know, where are your sources? This is a lie. Why are you trying to steal history? You know, you're lying. Why are people listening to this idiot? And obviously the customary, we was kings and whatever. Like that's the customary one. But those people are illiterate, so I don't even bother with those. Those are like children. But more than a lot of folks were coming out and saying a lot of these crazy things. And I was looking at them and saying that, look, at the end of the day, why are you so concerned about what Africans are learning about their own history? If you're superior to us, why are you on an African or Pan-African channel focused on educating our people and criticizing the veracity of what I'm saying? So I started looking at the comments even closer, and I started finding a through line that really highlighted why I believe that so many people have a problem with Africans and Black folks. Guys, stay with me, guys. You know, that's why I had to come out here to do this talk, because this thing really just got me when I was, you know, out and about. So I started looking at it, and guys were like, you should want to know the truth. And I'm like, wait a second. You've spent the last, I don't know, 100, 200, 500 years corrupting history, lying about history, writing books and educational systems that omit hundreds of years of our history, wiping things out. You came to Africa, divided it, created these artificial borders. You took slaves to America. You cut them off from their history, then taught them a corrupted, fake version of history that begins and ends with you. You gave us Christianity, where we had to bow and worship gods that were in your image, and so on and so forth. None of these guys had a problem with that. And then I was thinking that, why is it that the only time you come to my channel or you have anything to say is when I'm saying something positive about Africa? And more importantly, like, not only am I saying something positive about Africa, if I'm saying something counter to your belief that Africa never had anything to do with civilization. Guys, stay with me, guys. So I was looking at it, and I was looking at the comments, and I said, oh, you know what? I see what's happening here. You see, the reality of white supremacy, the reality of the dominion that the dominant society has had over Africa and Black people, is the illusion of Sorry, guys, I'm going to have to navigate a little bit here. Ooh, damn. The illusion of superiority. Now, in order to have an illusion or to create that illusion, you need to control information. You need to control education. You need to control the past. You need to control history. You need to control the narrative of the people that you're trying to subjugate. Guys, stay with me. So I saw that, you see, the issue here is that for all these centuries, we've not had the ability or the will. The will is actually a very, very important factor. The will to educate ourselves. We've been sold into this sort of mentality that it is for us to beg somebody else and to beg them that, you know, why don't you change your curriculum? Look at what you're doing. Look at the news. Look at all this information that you're putting out there. You're not telling us the truth about Africa. Why should they tell us the truth about Africa? Why should they tell us the truth about Africa? They don't benefit from that. But the people, and this is why I said that people really know what's going on. Why is everybody commenting on my page now? These white folks and people from Europe and Latin America, non-black folks, non-Africans, so concerned that I'm talking about positive things about my continent. Because in order for them to be superior, we need to be inferior. Stay with me, guys. Stay with me. Look at the beauty. Look at the beauty here. We need to be inferior. That's what the MEC is bringing out to you guys. That's the reason why the MEC's platform exists. That's why my platform exists. In order for them to be superior, we've got to be inferior. So the last thing they want is for this group of people that has been beaten down so much to start getting into a position where they actually have a history. They actually teach themselves and their children that we contributed meaningfully to civilization. And in fact, as some people have argued, Africans are the only people who ever had the original civilizations, because European civilizations were just warmongers. All they did was wage war and conquer. Civil, is that civil? To constantly be waging war and conquering people? We didn't conquer. Africa wasn't built on conquest. African kingdoms wasn't built on conquest. That is the reason why we were able to live side by side without borders. How were African kingdoms able to survive for thousands of years borderless? Because guys weren't afraid that somebody was going to come in and try and conquer them for no reason. African tribes or African kingdoms got conquered when the king was sloppy and the people wanted him gotten rid of. That's how it happened, folks. I figured it out and I said, you know what? I think I understand exactly what is going on. These folks require you to stay in your place. And that is the reason why we can't do that. That is the reason why this work is so important. Because I look at the comments, and you can go to the comments of my videos now and you'll see them everywhere. Any video where I talk about the greatness of Africa, Al-Kabolan, the videos are flooded with these guys who all of a sudden are very concerned with truth and proof. Now I'm going to ask you something, another question, folks. Stay with me, think about this. If somebody is asking for proof and evidence of the stuff I talk about when I talk about true ancient African history, where's the evidence supposed to come from? True, serious question. Because all the books in history class, all the archives in the libraries, all the documents that you can find, they're all written by your ancestors. The ancestors who lied, stole, cheated, pillaged, raped, destroyed, conquered, colonized, enslaved. They're the guys who wrote the history books. That's where we're supposed to find the evidence. What evidence are we going to find? What evidence are we going to find? You know? So for me, I'm looking at that situation and saying to myself that, oh, it's because you know we can't find the evidence. That's the reason why you're asking us to go and get proof. Because the way that I view it is like this. If you destroyed all the proof, your ancestors did. Your ancestors burned things, destroyed things, stole things, hid things, manipulated things. Where exactly is the proof supposed to come from? Because our perspective and the way that, sorry, the lifeguards here are blowing whistle, people are too deep in the ocean. Because the way that things are, and let me be real here, is guys strategically hid the stuff that I try and put out there. They strategically hid it. And the important thing is that folks need you to stay in a position of inferiority and begging and victimhood in order for them to feel comfortable. Because you have to remember, a lot of the people who are complaining about you talking, their entire existence, their entire superiority, their entire value, Martin Luther King talked about this, is based on being white, on having white skin and feeling like no matter how low I am, at least I'm better than you. That's the problem. That's what we're fighting against. This concept that we need to accept that position as Africans. We don't. So I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing. And now that I understand the complexities of this thing, and now I understand the reason why, of course they go, listen, how can you not hate and have animosity towards people that you, even in spite of all the abuse that you've done, all the advantages that you know you have inherently in society, all the thefts and these guys are still rocking. We're still here. This is what I feel, because I looked at my comments and it doesn't, I mean, on the surface, it doesn't make sense. And now that I've explained it, it makes sense. But why is that? Like, you know, I'm not even spreading, these are the videos I have the most hate on are the ones when I'm not even talking about white society. I'm literally just saying, this is where we came from, this is what we did, these are the amazing things our African ancestors did. All of a sudden, you have a problem with that, because I'm reframing what you believe the situation to be. Why do you care that the fact is that Africa is big enough to hold the United States, China, Europe, and all of these? That's how big Africa is. Why have you got an issue with that? What's the problem? The map is upside down. Of course it is. Because orientation is a choice. North, south, east, west. You make a decision. People are talking about compass, the north and the compass. I'm like, yeah, whatever the point the compass points to, it's your decision to call it what you want to call it. You could call it south if you want, tiddlywinks, whatever. You call it north and you say that's the top because of your perspective. All of a sudden, that's a problem. So we've got to accept your perspective. If you don't care about it and it doesn't matter what the perspective is, accept our perspective. Make Africa the top of the world. If we really don't care, you see, that's the acid test. If they really think this is a stupid argument, why don't you draw maps and draw everything where Africa is at the top of the world? Turn everything upside. Nobody cares, right? It doesn't matter. Why don't you do that? It's not rocket science, folks. It's not rocket science. Anyway, guys, those are my thoughts. That's what I think is going on. I'm going to keep pushing. I'm going to even be more aggressive now in the way that I talk about true African history. I'm going to be much more aggressive about it. And the channel is going to keep growing, you know.
Today we are going to be talking about the Great Wall of Benin. Benin in Nigeria. How did this wall, how was it built? What happened to this wall? Where is it now? The Kingdom of Benin is still an important part of African century, but it flourished in between the 13th and the 19th century. Benin is located in the southern western part of Nigeria, and Benin City is the capital. I know that when you hear Benin is very popular for the Benin bronzes, you know, those Benin artifacts, the ones that were stolen by the British that are displayed in the British Museum. I think it was stolen at the British expedition in 1897 in Benin. So, you know, some of them got returned, some never got returned till today. It was during the British expedition where they stole all the artifacts I was talking about. That was when the Wall of Benin was damaged. In the 1974 edition of the Guinness Book of Records, the Wall of Benin is recorded as the largest earthwork carried out before modern era by mankind, because, you know, the walls were built by Benin people back then. It was the wall that helped Benin resist a lot of attack because the wall totally surrounded the city. Part of the walls ahead are still visible today. If you are from Benin and you are watching this, please let me know if this can be confirmed, if the part of the walls are still visible, if you can confirm this story and tell us more about this wall.
The Kingdom of Benin, also known as the Edo Empire, was a kingdom located in the southwestern region of what is now Nigeria, lasting for at least 600 years under the Oba dynasty, and around 1,000 more if we count the previous Ogiso dynasty. Benin was one of the longest-lasting states in West Africa, home to a capital city which awed visitors, a system of earthworks rivaling the Great Wall of China in length, and some of Africa's most famous works of art. This kingdom is an underappreciated gem of world history. The Kingdom of Benin has its origins in antiquity, first as a confederation of towns and villages, and then as a kingdom known as Igodo Migodo, ruled by monarchs known as Ogisos, or Sky Kings, from around the 1st century BCE. We have some seemingly mythologized elements, with tales of heroes slaying man-eating beasts. It's only around the 12th century, give or take about a century, depending on the estimate, that Benin begins to transition out of the semi-mythical age, followed by the legendary foundations of the Oba dynasty. It was also during this period that we find the origins for both of the kingdom's popular names, Benin and Edo, building the inner wall of Benin City, part of a network of barriers called Iya in Edo, and collectively known as the Walls of Benin in English. Despite this name, the Walls of Benin aren't walls in the standard sense, but earthworks, deep moats paired with artificial hills made from the removed soil, running parallel to the ditches. Within the moats, vegetation was allowed to grow, creating an additional barrier to crossing. From the bottoms of the ditches to the tops of the moats, these earthworks could be as tall as 25 feet in the longer outer walls and 50 feet along the inner wall. At 15 meters long, and up to 50 feet tall from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the moat, these inner walls make up only a small portion of the Iya as a whole, however. The outer walls are shorter, up to about 25 feet from ditch to peak, but stretch across a much longer length, at approximately 16,000 kilometers long, only about 5 kilometers shorter than the Great Wall of China, and made with dozens of times the material of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Europeans began establishing trade relationships with the kingdom in the late 15th century, starting with the Portuguese, who were followed by others such as the English and Dutch through the 16th and 17th centuries. Side note, the modern-day Republic of Benin takes its name from this bite, hence why there's a country completely distinct from the Kingdom of Benin which shares its name. Many of these visitors were awed by the splendor of Benin City, which they often called Great Benin. One Portuguese source from 1691 describes the city thusly: Great Benin, where the king resides, is larger than Lisbon. All the streets run straight and far as the eye can see. The houses are large, especially that of the king, which is richly decorated and has fine columns. The city is wealthy and industrious. It is so well governed that theft is unknown, and the people live in such security that they have no doors to their houses. A Dutch source from 1668 gives some further details about the organization and architecture of the city. Houses are built alongside the streets in good order, the one close to the other. Adorned with gables and steps, they are usually broad with long galleries inside, especially so in the case of the houses of the nobility, and divided into many rooms, which are separated by walls made of red clay, very well erected. The source adds that these walls were kept as shiny and smooth by washing and rubbing as any wall in Holland can be made with chalk, and they are like mirrors. The upper stories are made of the same sort of clay. Moreover, every house is provided with a well for the supply of fresh water. This source further gives us a description of the royal palace. The king's court is square and located in the right-hand side of the city, as one enters it through the gate of Gotten. It is about the same size as the city of Haarlem, and entirely surrounded by a special wall, comparable to the one which encircles the town. It is divided into many magnificent palaces, houses and apartments of the courtiers, and comprises beautiful and long squares with galleries, about as large as the Exchange in Amsterdam. The buildings are of different sizes, however, resting on wooden pillars from top to bottom lined with copper casts, on which pictures of their war exploits and battles are engraved. All of them are being very well maintained. Most of the buildings within this court are covered with palm leaves instead of square planks, and every roof is adorned with a small spiraled tower, on which cast copper birds are standing, being very artfully sculpted and lifelike with their wings spread. Brass casting was a skill first refined in Ile-Ife, where it was used to create lifelike busts of important figures. While in Ile-Ife, brass casts were typically depicted with more naturalistic facial features, in Benin, faces were typically depicted in a much more stylized way. Additionally, Benin pioneered cast brass reliefs, the plaques now frequently called the Benin bronzes. These plaques, as described above, decorated the walls of the royal palace and depicted the history and exploit of the Obas. In addition to brass casts, Benin was known for wood and ivory carving. In some cases, entire elephant tusks would be covered in carved images. These would often be placed at altars to past Obas, mounted in stands made in the likenesses of the Obas whose spirits were believed to reside within them. In other cases, ivory was carved into valuable bracelets or armbands. By the 1880s, the British, who had gradually established control over much of the surrounding territory in today's Nigeria, became sick of the Oba's protectionist control over trade. While the Oba resisted efforts to make Benin a British protectorate, in 1892 they successfully convinced he and some of his officials to sign a treaty expanding British influence over the empire. In 1897, a British delegation attempted to enter Benin City, but their request was denied as a festival was going on at the time. Even so, the delegation continued toward Benin City. Believing that the true intention of the delegation was to stage an invasion and replace the Oba, several generals launched a preemptive attack on them, slaughtering most of the British representatives. The British launched an actual 1,200-man-strong invasion of Benin City in response, labeled the Punitive Expedition. They successfully captured the city, and proceeded to loot its treasures and burn the city to the ground. Some of the artwork was given to the British Museum, where it remains today, while the majority was sold off to various buyers. Today this art remains scattered across the world, from North America to Indonesia. Very little remains in the hands of the Edo people. The Kingdom of Benin was never actually dissolved, and while it is now part of Nigeria rather than an independent nation, it still exists in Edo State, where Obas still rule. With several museums returning or announcing plans to return artifacts looted from Benin to Nigeria within the last few years. While much of the looted art remains on display or in private hands where it may be difficult to retrieve, some progress has been made towards returning what was stolen, which includes not only artwork that will bring value to Nigeria, but also spiritually significant pieces from altars. Moreover, the more Benin bronzes are returned to a single place, the more we'll be able to reassemble them into their original context as a chronicle of Edo history.
They called it the Great Wall of Africa. A structure so vast, so intricate, that European explorers could scarcely believe it had been built by human hands. It stretched for over 16,000 kilometers, dwarfing even the Great Wall of China in sheer length. But this was no ordinary wall. It was a fortress, a masterpiece of engineering, and the very heart of one of Africa's most powerful kingdoms, Benin. For hundreds of years, these walls kept enemies at bay, guarding a kingdom so rich in art, trade, and military prowess that it rivaled the great civilizations of the world. They were not built of stone like European castles, nor were they mere defensive barriers. They were an interconnected system of moats, ridges, and earthen ramparts that made the city of Benin one of the most well-defended places in the world. But in 1897, the walls met the greatest challenge. The British Empire, fueled by greed and a thirst for conquest, launched a punitive expedition to do what no force before had ever accomplished: breach the great walls of Benin and bring the kingdom to its knees. But this was not an easy war. What the British thought would be a swift invasion turned into a grueling fight against warriors who knew their land, their walls, and their enemy far too well. It was a battle of strategy, endurance, and betrayal, a battle that would ultimately lead to the fall of one of Africa's greatest civilizations. This is the story of the walls of Benin and those who dared to breach them. To understand why the walls were built, we must go back to the roots of Benin's power. The Kingdom of Benin was founded around the 11th century in what is now southern Nigeria. The kingdom grew under the rule of the Obas, powerful kings who expanded their territory through warfare, diplomacy, and economic dominance. By the 15th century, Benin had become one of the most sophisticated kingdoms in Africa, with a well-organized military, a booming trade system, and a capital city that amazed European visitors. But power attracts enemies. Neighboring kingdoms, jealous of Benin's wealth, launched raids. Foreign traders, seeing the kingdom's vast resources, plotted ways to take control. The Obas knew they needed to protect their empire, not just with warriors, but with an unbreakable defense. And so, the walls of Benin were built. This was no ordinary construction project. The walls were not a single structure but a complex system of fortifications. According to scholars, they were constructed over several centuries, reaching their peak in the 14th and 15th centuries. The walls consisted of a vast network of ramparts and moats, stretching over 16,000 kilometers, making it the largest man-made structure in pre-colonial Africa. Deep trenches and ditches, strategically dug to slow down invaders and trap them in ambush zones. Multiple layers of walls, with the inner walls protecting the royal palace and the outer walls shielding the entire kingdom. The walls were built using a technique known as rammed earth construction, where thousands of laborers compacted earth with water, layer by layer, to create walls strong enough to withstand attacks. It is estimated that the construction took more material than the Great Pyramid of Giza, making it one of the greatest engineering feats in human history. By the 15th and 16th centuries, when European explorers arrived, they were stunned. A Dutch visitor in the 1600s wrote, "Benin City is larger than Amsterdam. The streets are wide, the houses are clean, and the city is well governed. The walls stretch beyond sight, and no European city can compare to its order and greatness." But for the people of Benin, the walls were more than just physical barriers, they were a symbol of their power and identity. For centuries, the walls did the job. They repelled invaders, rival kingdoms, and rebellious factions. They ensured that the Oba of Benin controlled trade on his own terms. When the Portuguese arrived in the 15th century, seeking gold, spices, and slaves, they quickly realized that Benin was not a kingdom to be bullied. Unlike many African states, Benin controlled its interactions with Europeans. In 1897, Britain decided to take what it could not negotiate. It began with deception. The British, under the pretext of diplomacy, sent a delegation to Benin City in January 1897. But the Oba, suspecting treachery, refused to allow them in. The British, insulted and eager for an excuse to attack, declared war on Benin. A force of 1,200 British soldiers, armed with machine guns, cannons, and explosives, was sent to destroy what had stood for centuries. The Oba of Benin was captured and exiled, and the kingdom was brought under British rule. The once mighty walls, symbols of Benin's greatness, were left in ruins. Today, only fragments of these walls remain. Many have been destroyed by urban development, and others have been lost to time. But their legacy endures. Archaeologists consider them one of the greatest achievements of African engineering. Historians recognize them as a testament to Benin's power, innovation, and resilience. And for the people of modern-day Nigeria, the walls remain a symbol of resistance, a reminder of a time when their ancestors built a fortress so strong that it took the full force of an empire to bring it down. But did the British truly conquer Benin? Or did the spirit of its people, its art, and its history survive, waiting for the day when the world would once again recognize its greatness? One thing is certain, the walls of Benin may have fallen, but their legend will never die. The story of the walls of Benin is more than just history, it's a testament to resilience, strength, and the struggle against imperial conquest. But history is only powerful when it is remembered and shared. At Native Historian, we are dedicated to uncovering the hidden truths of history, the stories that were erased, and the legacies that still shape our world today. If you believe these stories need to be told, then let's keep this journey alive.
In present-day Nigeria, deep in the forests of Edo State, once stood a city so advanced, powerful, that European explorers called it one of the best planned cities in the world. It had paved streets, waste management, stunning architecture, and a system of walls and moats stretching over 10,000 miles, all built by hand. This was the Kingdom of Benin, not the modern-day country called Benin. We're talking about the ancient Benin Empire, a place of artistry, order, and strength. So why don't we hear about it? Because in 1897, the British erased it. This is the story of what they tried to destroy, and why it matters more now than ever before. The Benin Kingdom was founded over 1,100 years ago, ruled by kings known as Obas, believed to be divine. Not just rulers, but the living bridge between the spiritual and physical worlds. Benin wasn't just powerful, it was organized. Cities were planned in grid patterns, homes built with symmetry and respect for hierarchy, Spiritual symbols were carved into wood, bronze, and ivory, documenting stories, lineages, wars, and victories. And the walls of Benin? They weren't just for defense. They were a statement, a way to control trade, keep order, and display the sheer scale of Benin's engineering mastery. According to the Guinness Book of Records, they were the largest man-made earthworks in the world, built over centuries by communities across the region in what was the most extensive and ambitious construction project in African history. Long before bronze was placed in glass cases, it was placed on altars. In Benin, art was never just for admiration, it was for communion. Every line carved into ivory, every face cast in bronze, carried spiritual weight. The Oba wasn't just a king, he was divine. A living bridge between the earthly world and the realm of the ancestors. Behind the palace walls stood shrines, not just symbols of faith, but living spaces of memory. Here, rituals honored the spirits of those who came before. Offerings were made, stories were told. Power wasn't held alone. It was shared with the ancestors. Even the great bronze plaques we now see in museums were once embedded in temple walls. They weren't meant to decorate, they were meant to invoke. Each piece was a spiritual technology, keeping the link between past and present alive. So when the British looted them in 1897, it wasn't just art that was stolen, it was memory, identity, the sacred itself. And yet, fragments remain, in the echoes of rituals still performed, in the shrines quietly tended, in the reverence that refuses to fade. History often forgets the women. But in Benin, the Queen Mother, the Iyoba, was unforgettable. She wasn't a background figure. She had her own palace, her own court, and in some cases, her own army. Her role wasn't just ceremonial, it was strategic. When an Oba rose to power, his mother rose with him, as protector, advisor, and sometimes even ruler in his absence. Take Queen Idia, perhaps the most famous Iyoba. Her influence during the reign of Oba Esegi in the 16th century helped preserve the kingdom in times of war and succession crisis. She led armies, brokered peace, and ensured the dynasty's survival. Her face, dignified and adorned, still appears on some of the most iconic Benin ivory masks today. But it wasn't just the Queen Mother. Women in Benin served as diplomats, merchants, and spiritual leaders. They negotiated with Europeans, organized market systems, and even trained as elite bodyguards within the palace. This was a society where women's power wasn't hidden, it was institutionalized. So when colonial narratives painted African societies as backward or primitive, they erased not just kingdoms, but queens. Benin tells a different story, one where matriarchs helped build empires, and where feminine strength was not feared, but crowned. Benin's greatness didn't stop at walls. The kingdom became a major player in global trade, interacting with the Portuguese as early as the 15th century. They exported ivory, pepper, palm oil, and yes, slaves. That part of the story is uncomfortable, but true. Like many powerful African states at the time, Benin took part in the Atlantic slave trade, selling war captives and criminals into bondage. But it was also known for something else, something priceless. The Benin bronzes. Thousands of bronze plaques and sculptures cast with incredible precision that depicted obas, warriors, animals, and spiritual beings. They weren't just art, they were records, historical timelines carved in metal. These bronzes sat in palaces, altars, and shrines until the British came. In 1897, after a diplomatic dispute and the killing of some British officials, the British launched a full-scale punitive expedition. Over 1,200 British troops invaded Benin City, looting everything in sight. They torched the city, destroyed temples, burned homes, and carted away over 3,000 bronze sculptures, masks, ivory tusks, and sacred items. Oba Ovonramwen, the reigning king, was exiled to Calabar. The kingdom fell. The story of Benin was buried under colonial silence. And where did the bronzes go? To the British Museum? To Germany, France, and the US. They sit behind glass, robbed of their context, their power, their home. For over a century, Benin's history was whispered, not taught. In schools, the story was missing. The walls were swallowed by forest, the bronzes hidden overseas. But today, that's changing. In 2022, Germany began returning stolen Benin bronzes to Nigeria. The British Museum is under mounting pressure to do the same. And Nigeria is building the Edo Museum of West African Art, a stunning new complex that will reclaim Benin's legacy and house its history. Young Nigerians are asking questions. Creators, educators, and historians are spreading the truth online. The walls may be gone, but the story is rising again. The Kingdom of Benin isn't just a lost empire. It's a symbol of what Africa was, organized, artistic, intelligent, and powerful before colonization. It's a reminder of what was stolen, and a call to reclaim our roots, reshape our narrative, and remember that African history didn't begin with slavery. It was interrupted by it. They tried to erase a kingdom. But you're watching this now. That means it didn't work. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Learn. Let's make sure the next generation knows what the last one was never taught. And keep uncovering the truths they tried to bury.
By the late 19th century, the British Empire had set its sights on Africa, eager to expand its influence and exploit its vast resources. Benin, one of the last independent African kingdoms, stood in the way. The Edo people had fiercely protected their land, refusing to submit to colonial control, but Britain was determined to change that by force. Tensions had been rising for years. The British wanted unrestricted trade access to Benin's palm oil and other resources, but the Oba maintained strict control over foreign trade. In 1897, Britain found its excuse for war. A British-led trade expedition, ignoring warnings from Benin's leaders, marched toward Benin City during a sacred festival. Edo warriors, seeing this as an act of aggression, attacked the invaders, killing several British officers. This gave Britain the justification it needed. The punitive expedition of 1897 was launched, a full-scale military assault led by over 1,200 British troops, armed with modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery. The Edo warriors fought bravely, but their weapons, spears and outdated muskets, were no match for British firepower. On February 18, 1897, British forces stormed Benin City. The battle was brutal, and the city was quickly overwhelmed. Fires engulfed the royal palace, sacred shrines were desecrated, and thousands of Edo people were killed or displaced. The Oba was captured and exiled to Calabar, where he would spend the rest of his life under British surveillance. But Britain wasn't just after control, they were after treasure. In one of the most infamous acts of cultural looting in history, British soldiers and officials ransacked Benin City, stealing thousands of priceless Benin bronzes, intricately crafted plaques, statues, and artifacts that told the story of Edo's history and culture. These treasures were shipped off to Britain, where they were sold to museums and private collectors across Europe and America. With Benin in ruins, the once great kingdom was absorbed into British Nigeria. The Edo people had lost their sovereignty, their Oba, and many of their sacred artifacts. But the story doesn't end there. The legacy of the Edo people would live on, and today calls for justice and the return of the Benin bronzes are stronger than ever. Though the Benin kingdom fell in 1897, the Edo people never lost their identity. Despite British rule, their culture, traditions, and monarchy endured. The British may have taken their wealth, but they could not erase the spirit of resilience. For decades, the Edo people struggled under colonial rule. The kingdom, now part of British Nigeria, the once great city of Benin, was stripped of its riches, and the monarchy was weakened. Yet in 1914, something remarkable happened. The British, realizing the deep-rooted significance of the Edo monarchy, allowed the return of the royal dynasty. Akenzua II, the son of the exiled Oba Ovonramwen, was crowned in 1933, restoring the Oba's throne, though under colonial oversight. As Nigeria gained independence in 1960, Benin City emerged as a center of culture and learning. The Edo people reclaimed their heritage, reviving ancient festivals, traditional art, and governance structures. Today, the Oba of Benin remains a highly respected figure, preserving the traditions of one of Africa's greatest civilizations. The British invasion destroyed Benin City, looted its treasures, and exiled its king. But despite this loss, the Edo people never disappeared. Their traditions, monarchy, and spirit survived, and today they continue the fight to reclaim their stolen history.
For too long, Africa's history has been misunderstood and misrepresented. Many believe that Africa is a continent without advanced civilizations or global connections until the West came along. But these ideas are far from the truth. Actually, Africa has a rich history full of powerful empires and incredible cultural achievements. Many assumptions and biases just make it hard for us to see the true beauty of the continent. So today, let's reach out for the truth. What mind-blowing facts can we find by questioning the world's biases? Let's find out. Myth number 1. Africa is a dark continent isolated from the rest of the world. It makes it sound like Africa was some distant, forgotten place with no connection to the world. It pushes the wrong idea that Africa needed to be saved by outsiders. But that's not the truth at all. Africa was never cut off. In fact, way before European colonizers showed up, Africans were already part of big global trade networks. The Swahili coast in East Africa was a busy place where Africans, Arabs, Persians, and Indians did business and shared cultures. Cities like Kilwa and Mombasa were full of trade, exchanging gold, ivory, and spices for goods like Chinese porcelain and silk from faraway places. The Kingdom of Aksum in today's Ethiopia was another powerful empire that traded with the Roman Empire and India. Aksum had its own coins and made deals with other big civilizations, proving Africa was fully involved in global affairs. And in Great Zimbabwe, archaeologists found Syrian glass and Chinese ceramics, which shows Africa was connected to global trade routes across continents. Saying Africa is isolated just isn't true. It ignores how deeply Africa was linked to the rest of the world through trade, culture, and diplomacy long before European powers showed up. Recognizing this truth helps us see the real richness of Africa's history and how connected it's always been. Myth number 2. Everyone in Africa is poor and has always been poor. One deeply established myth is that all Africans live in poverty and have always lived in poverty with no growing industries or opportunities. But historically, many African societies thrived economically and culturally long before the poverty stereotype even took hold. Kingdoms like Mali and Ghana were once powerful empires with prosperous trade networks. The Kingdom of Ghana, which thrived from about 300 CE to 1200 CE, became wealthy by controlling trade routes across the Sahara, where merchants exchanged gold, ivory, and salt. After Ghana, the Kingdom of Mali emerged around 1235 CE. Mali then continued to control vital trade routes and prosper from gold and salt, while the ancient city of Timbuktu became a key center for trade and education, known for its universities and libraries that attracted scholars from far and wide. Needless to say, many parts of Africa were thriving throughout history. Not all African nations today are poor either. Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, has a GDP of more than $594 billion and is projected to become one of the world's largest economies. Africa is also home to booming industries and vast natural resources. Take oil and gas, for example. Africa holds enormous potential in this sector, with the majority of global oil and gas discoveries in 2013 happening in Africa. Countries like Nigeria, Libya, Algeria, and Egypt export massive amounts of oil and gas to the global market. Africa's mineral resources are no joke either. South Africa alone produces 75% of the world's platinum, while countries like Guinea, Zambia, and Ghana are key exporters of minerals like bauxite, cobalt, and gold. These resources are very important not only to Africa's economy, but also to the global market. So, while some parts of Africa face challenges, the continent itself is far from the poverty-stricken narrative that is rather believed. There are industries, resources, and opportunities that continue to grow, and it's important to understand this broader picture. Myth number 3, Black Africans were biblically destined to be slaves. The myth that Black Africans were biblically destined to be slaves came from a deliberate misinterpretation of the Bible, specifically the narrative of the curse of Ham. This narrative was distorted by slave traders, colonizers, and pro-slavery theologians, claiming that Ham, one of Noah's sons, was cursed and his descendants were meant to be servants. They falsely associated this curse with Africans, claiming that they were meant to be the enslaved descendants of Ham, and using it to rationalize the brutal mistreatment of millions of people. Europeans, driven by greed and a hunger for power, began to institutionalize racial hierarchies, claiming that Africans were inherently inferior, both morally and intellectually. They described Africa as a land lacking in civilization, religion, and political systems, and painted Africans as primitive and underdeveloped. This racist ideology provided a moral justification for the Atlantic slave trade that allowed European colonizers to strip Africans of their humanity. By claiming that their actions were supported by the Bible, they were able to feel righteous while carrying out horrific acts. Myth number 5, Africa has made no contributions to global history. This myth comes from the dehumanization of African slaves and colonial stories. But is it true? Absolutely not. Africa's history is full of powerful kingdoms, empires, and cultures that shaped the world in many ways. Far from being isolated or primitive, Africa was a lively center of trade, culture, science, and governance long before Europeans arrived. Take ancient Egypt. It's over 5,000 years old and was a cradle of civilization. The incredible pyramids of Giza and advancements in math, astronomy, and medicine influenced ancient Greece a lot. The Mediterranean Sea was also historically a major hub of trade and cultural exchange, connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia. Ancient Egypt, located in North Africa, used the Mediterranean for trade and communication with other regions, including ancient Greece and the wider Mediterranean world. This sea facilitated the flow of ideas, goods, and innovations between these civilizations, making Africa an important influence on Mediterranean cultures. Egypt is just one part of Africa's history. In West Africa, the Kingdom of Mali became famous as a center of wealth and learning. Timbuktu's universities attracted scholars from all over the Islamic world, making it a hub of knowledge. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Kush built even more pyramids than Egypt and took control during the 25th dynasty. Africa also had its own way of governing. The Igbo people of Nigeria practiced a form of democracy through local gatherings long before the West developed its version. The Ashanti Empire had a system of checks and balances, and many African political systems focused on agreement and shared power. All of that being said, the myth that Africa has contributed nothing to world history is wrong, as Africa did indeed play a big part in human progress. Myth number 6, Africa is a dangerous place. A common misconception is that Africa as a whole is unsafe for travelers. While it's true that some areas may not be the best for tourism, this doesn't reflect the entire continent. The global media often focuses on the negative stories that highlight war, disease, and poverty. What often gets overlooked are the beautiful destinations in many African countries. In reality, there are plenty of safe and popular tourist spots in Africa that attract visitors from all over the world. Countries like Morocco, South Africa, Senegal, Ghana, and Tanzania offer everything from stunning beaches and breathtaking landscapes to rich cultures and welcoming locals. For example, Tanzania is home to Mount Kilimanjaro, Africa's highest peak, and the Serengeti National Park, famous for its wildlife and the Great Migration. Ghana is known for its historical forts, vibrant markets, and the beautiful Cape Coast, making it a must-see destination. In South Africa, cities like Cape Town and Johannesburg are filled with amazing sights, like the iconic Table Mountain and rich cultural experiences. Morocco boasts the stunning Sahara Desert, colorful souks, and historic cities like Marrakesh and Fez, which offer a blend of ancient traditions and modern hospitality. Recently, tourism in Africa is even growing rapidly, with the continent welcoming millions of international visitors each year. The United Nations World Tourism Organization reported that Africa saw a 10% increase in international tourist arrivals in 2019. This growth reflects travelers' interest in experiencing Africa's diverse cultures, stunning landscapes, and rich history. So while it's okay to be cautious when traveling anywhere, don't let the myth of danger keep you from exploring the wonders that Africa has to offer. Myth number 8, Africans only lived in huts. It's hard to believe, but even today, there are people who think that pre-colonial Africa was nothing more than a land of simple huts, with no signs of advanced architecture or civilization. This harmful stereotype reduces the complexity and diversity of African societies to a single, misguided image. Not only is this untrue, but it's also an insult to the rich history of architectural innovation and societal complexity that flourished across the continent. Yes, some Africans lived in huts, just as people around the world lived in similar types of homes depending on their environment and needs. But to suggest that this is all Africa had is to ignore a wealth of architectural ingenuity. Consider the Kingdom of Aksum in what is now Ethiopia, which thrived from around 100 AD to 940 AD. Aksum was famous for its towering obelisks, intricately carved from single pieces of stone, some of which stood over 24 meters tall. These obelisks, used as markers for royal tombs, are among the most impressive feats of engineering from any ancient civilization, rivaling structures in Europe and Asia in both skill and grandeur. In West Africa, we find another astonishing example in the Great Mosque of Djenné, located in present-day Mali. The original mosque, first built in the 13th century, was made from sun-baked mud bricks and plaster, demonstrating sophisticated construction techniques adapted to the local climate. The current structure, restored in 1907, remains the largest mud brick building in the world, showcasing an architectural tradition that spans centuries. Then there's Great Zimbabwe, a medieval city-state whose stone structures were built between the 11th and 15th centuries. The massive stone walls, some rising to 11 meters, were constructed without the use of mortar, relying solely on the precise placement of interlocking stones. This architectural marvel has mystified scholars for years, with its intricate design pointing to advanced knowledge of both engineering and urban planning. Great Zimbabwe was the heart of a powerful trading empire, connecting southern Africa to the wider Indian Ocean trade network. These examples aren't just isolated occurrences or exceptions to the rule, because they represent a long and proud tradition of architectural and societal development across Africa. So the next time someone says Africa only has huts, remind them of the magnificent cities, monumental structures, and innovative engineering that testify to Africa's advanced civilizations, long before colonization ever touched the continent. Myth number 9, Africa had no writing. This myth is really painful because so many people believe it. The idea that writing in Africa started with colonization is not only wrong, but also silences centuries of African voices and histories. The truth is, Africa had its own writing systems that were created before or independently from European influence. One of the best examples is the Vai script from Liberia. Created in the early 19th century by Momolu Dualu Bukele, this script was designed specifically for the Vai language. At one time, the literacy rate among the Vai people was even higher than in parts of Europe and the United States. The Vai script is still used today, showing Africa's rich intellectual history. Another important writing system is the Ge'ez script from Ethiopia. This ancient language has been written for over 1,600 years and is still used in religious texts, and to write languages like Amharic and Tigrinya. Ethiopia's tradition of written records and literature is among the oldest in the world, which proves that Africa had ways of writing long before European colonization. In North Africa, the Tifinagh script is another example of Africa's writing tradition. Used by the Berber-speaking Tuareg people, it has roots going back to at least the 3rd century BCE. In West Africa, the Nko script was developed in the 1940s by Solomana Kante to write Manding languages, and it has become a vital tool for literacy and cultural preservation. Additionally, the Osmania script was created in the early 20th century for the Somali language. These are just a few of the many African scripts that show a long and rich tradition of writing. The existence of these systems reflects centuries of creativity, knowledge, and a strong desire to preserve African stories and cultures. Myth number 13, Africans are primitive and lack innovation. The idea that Africa is primitive is a long-standing misconception. This term isn't scientifically valid, It's more of a derogatory label used by Europeans and Americans to describe cultures that are different from their own. People often toss around primitive to refer to those who don't adopt Western behaviors and technology, but that view is outdated and honestly insulting. African societies have their own diverse lifestyles, arts, and technologies, each influenced by their culture and environment. Far from lacking innovation, Africa has made many advancements in technology, governance, social structures, and art. Today, several African cities are using technologies that rival or even surpass those in some Western countries. For example, many African nations are adopting telecommunication systems that even offer better connectivity than some parts of the United States. The idea that Africans are primitive doesn't reflect the reality of their skills or achievements. It's simply an insult that distorts the truth. As we've seen, the myths surrounding Africa have created a distorted picture of the continent and its people. These misconceptions have undermined Africa's rich history, innovation, and diversity for far too long. It's really important to understand that Africa is not a monolithic land of poverty, disease, or stagnation, but a dynamic continent with vibrant cultures, advanced technologies, and limitless potential. If we can address these misconceptions, we can begin to see Africa for what it truly is, a continent that continues to make valuable contributions to the world. So, the next time you hear these myths, remember the truth and help spread a more accurate and respectful understanding of Africa. Let's celebrate the resilience, beauty, and brilliance of this incredible continent and its people.
President Donald Trump has intensified his efforts to reshape America's historical narrative with a controversial executive order targeting the Smithsonian institutions. Last month, he signed the order which opposes what he terms as divisive, race-centered ideology, placing the National Museum of African American History and Culture directly at the center of his political agenda.
The censorship we see going on, whether it's the banning of books, whether it's an effort to alter history of websites, whether it's erasing Jackie Robinson or Harriet Tubman or Colin Powell from government websites, all of that smacks of some type of medieval, communistic censorship plot and plan. We must resist it.
One of the things that I think you hit home is that no one has the right to erase the work that we've contributed to this country. The Committee on House Administration that oversees the Smithsonian wrote a letter to Mr. Vance, and he stated in part, his flagrant attempt to erase Black history is unacceptable and must be stopped. The attempt to paper over elements of American history is both cowardly and unpatriotic.
Look, I think I'm glad they wrote the letter. I think they should take to the House floor. I think they should call whoever needs to be called before House and Senate committees to answer for this. No group of people, not the Irish, not the Italians, not the Germans, not Jewish Americans, would sit for 1 minute and allow their history and contributions to be tortured, contorted, or erased. They would not, and we will not either.
Do you know, Mark, if there is any ways that even the vice president can actually put a stop to what's happening, though they sent that letter?
It can be stopped by the Congress of the United States. They simply need the courage to do it. But the people must bring pressure. It is disheartening, but let me say this.
Yeah.
We need to make a commitment that we will learn African American history the way I learned African American history when I was a child. I learned it in my home. I learned it in the church. I learned it in the community. I learned it from the books that my parents had on their shelves, whether it was Martin Luther King's books or Malcolm X's books or W.B. Du Bois's books, whether it was, going to Emancipation Day celebrations at Greater St. Stephen's Baptist Church in New Orleans, when I was a teenager. We have to make a commitment through our own institutions, through our churches, and we've got to hold our public schools accountable to tell history in a complete and thorough fashion. No community would stand for the elimination of their history or some control on the perspective. So we have to stand up. We have to speak out. Our museum in Harlem, the Urban Civil Rights Museum in Harlem, which will open in 2026, is going to be unique. It's not a government museum. It's not overseen by any governmental agency. It is a private museum that will be open to the public. It is a National Urban League initiative. We're putting our 115 years of being one of the nation's leading civil rights organizations on the line and pouring into this. So we have a place that people can learn, study, experience African American history, civil rights history from a Northern experience perspective.
When you have these museums that exist to be able to tell those stories, and like you said, they can't even tell the full extent of the experience. But why is it so important to make sure these places stand tall?
Because for a long time, our history was erased, suppressed, twisted, not told. Told from a perspective of those that created the system of slavery, segregation, and oppression. And they told it in an inauthentic way. Look, my fourth grade textbook told the story of slavery being a system where white Americans or white North Americans brought enslaved Africans here to civilize them. That the Native Americans, the indigenous community, they worship pagan gods and they needed to be Christianized. That was what my history book in the South, in New Orleans, in fourth grade said. I remember reading it distinctly. I remember it as being something that burned my inner soul. You know, as a fourth grader in a class where maybe 12 to 15% of the students were Black, one knew not how to express outrage at that. But I tucked it away. And when I got to high school and I got an opportunity to find my voice, when my high school teacher talked about the Civil War not being a war for slavery, but being a war for economics against Northern aggression, my hand went up and I challenged him. Because that's what my passion and my understanding of history required in that moment, to challenge false narratives. And I challenged that narrative that it was not a war of Northern aggression. It was not a war for economics, that slavery and economics were one and the same, right? Free labor helped to produce crops at an inexpensive level that was sold for huge profits in the global trading market. This sugar, the cotton, the soybeans, the peanuts, the tobacco, the indigo, all got shipped in many respects to Europe and beyond, or shipped to the North to be consumed by others at great profits, and great wealth was created, you know, through that system. And Black people ended up being emancipated with nothing. No 40 acres, no mule, not even an acre, not even a check, not even a house. We were emancipated with nothing. You're free to go. Where will you go? Where can you work? Where can you live? I mean, we've got to understand that history, and you know, if it makes people uncomfortable, get used to being uncomfortable with the truth. The truth is the truth. And this is not about, you know, just trying to shame or blame. It's about telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I think we have to recognize that you cannot heal unless you tell the truth. You cannot move forward unless history is told in an accurate fashion. And I think many Americans, many white Americans, recognize that.
A few weeks ago, something big happened, but it didn't make many headlines. The U.S. military arrived in Ghana, not with speeches or lectures, but with gifts. 14 armored vehicles, sleek, intimidating, and powerful. A gesture of goodwill, they said, a sign of the strong partnership between the United States and Ghana. But just days later, everything changed. In a move that stunned many across the continent, Ghana's president didn't return the favor with praise. Instead, he hit back hard. In a statement published by The Guardian, President John Mahama directly criticized the United States, not just for meddling in African affairs, but for something far more audacious, trying to rewrite Africa's history. Yes, you heard that right. While Washington talks about democracy and cooperation, Africa's leaders are beginning to see the shadows behind the smiles. And this time, President Mahama didn't stay silent. His words weren't just bold, they were historic. The kind of defiance we rarely see, but deeply crave in African leadership. We're breaking it all down. The U.S. military presence in Ghana, the deeper meaning behind Mahama's explosive statement, and what this moment says about the future of African sovereignty. Because what's happening right now is bigger than diplomacy. It's a battle for history, for identity, and for the soul of the continent. A few weeks ago, the world watched as South Africa's president Cyril Ramaphosa stepped into the White House for a meeting with Donald Trump. Officially, it was meant to ease tensions, a diplomatic handshake to calm the storm brewing between South Africa and the United States. But what unfolded behind closed doors was anything but peaceful. From the moment the cameras started rolling, it was clear. Trump had an agenda. He wasn't interested in nuance or diplomacy. No, he was there to confront Ramaphosa with a narrative he firmly believed, that white South Africans were being hunted, victims of what he called white genocide. To make his case, Trump didn't cite policy. He didn't reference facts. Instead, he played videos, including one of Julius Malema, leader of the EFF, chanting the controversial "Kill the Boer" song. It was political theater, raw and aggressive. And through it all, President Ramaphosa was forced onto the defensive. He later claimed the meeting ended well, but the truth? It was painfully obvious. Trump never backed down from his claims. Not even when South Africa's Democratic Alliance, a party with a largely white voter base, publicly dismissed the idea of white genocide as utter nonsense. And while most African leaders stayed quiet, one voice broke through the silence. Ghana's president, John Mahama. Unapologetically Pan-African and unshaken by Western politics, Mahama did what few others dared. He spoke, not just for Ghana, but for South Africa, and for the dignity of Africans everywhere. His words were sharp, unfiltered, and deliberate. In the face of global misinformation, he chose clarity. In the face of silence, he chose courage. We break down that meeting, the racial politics behind it, and why President Mahama's stand may be one of the most powerful moments of Pan-African leadership in recent years. Because this wasn't just a political clash, it was a battle over the truth, and the fight for Africa's voice on the global stage. It was a statement that echoed across the continent, sharp, unapologetic, and long overdue. In a move that stunned many and inspired millions, President John Mahama of Ghana broke his silence. And when he spoke, he didn't mince words. He called Donald Trump's claims of a so-called white genocide in South Africa not just false, but an outright insult to every African. But this wasn't just about fact-checking a former US president. No, this was about something deeper, something darker. According to Mahama, Trump wasn't just spreading misinformation. He was attempting to do what colonizers and apologists have tried to do for centuries, rewrite African history. And if you stop and think about it, it hits hard. For over 200 years, Black South Africans endured colonization. Then came apartheid, a brutal, calculated system of racial segregation that lasted nearly half a century. Entire communities were torn apart, families destroyed, protesters gunned down. And through it all, the world stood by in silence. No US president spoke of genocide then, no outcry from Western leaders. Instead, the very man who led the anti-apartheid movement, Nelson Mandela, was branded a terrorist and thrown in prison for 27 years, placed on America's terror watch list for daring to demand freedom. Fast forward to today, and suddenly, without evidence, the story has flipped. A new narrative pushed by Donald Trump, that white South Africans are now the victims of a hidden genocide. And somehow, the world listens. President Mahama saw through it. He called it what it was. Not just a lie, but a dangerous distortion, a weaponized narrative designed to twist the past and stain the present. In his powerful statement, Mahama wrote, It is not enough to be affronted by these claims or to casually dismiss them as untruths. These statements are a clear example of how language can be leveraged to extend the effects of previous injustices. This mode of violence has long been used against indigenous Africans, and it cannot simply be met with silence, not anymore. This isn't just about Trump, it's about the power of words, the violence of false history, and the refusal of African leaders to let the truth be rewritten, again. These are not just words, they are a call to arms, a truth that every Pan-African, every freedom fighter, and every believer in the dignity of this continent must take seriously. For far too long, Africa's story has been written by outsiders, by those who carved borders with no regard for history, who took resources and left behind ruins, and who now use their platforms to reshape Africa's image through selective headlines and whispered lies. They say Africa cannot govern itself. They say colonization brought order. They say we are poor, needy, forever dependent on foreign aid and foreign mercy. And the world? It believed them. Because for decades, Africans chose silence over confrontation. Because too often, we turned the other cheek, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. But as President John Mahama boldly declared, not anymore. In his address, Mahama reminded us of something fundamental. African nations learned long ago that their fates are inextricably linked. When it comes to interactions with the world beyond our continent, we are each other's bellwether. In other words, if one African nation is under attack, all are under attack. If one is disrespected, all are disrespected. And if one stands tall, all should rise with it. But somewhere along the way, we forgot. Instead of unity, we've embraced isolation. Instead of solidarity, we've grown indifferent. African nations now look inward, minding their own business, as if that's enough to survive in a world that still sees us as expendable. But that's not even the worst part. Because in the silence, in the division, the old narratives return, stronger, louder, more dangerous. And unless Africa rises with one voice, we risk letting the past rewrite our future. But instead of rising together, we've witnessed something far more tragic and far more dangerous. African nations, once bound by a shared struggle, are now turning on each other, not just with words, but with weapons. Take ECOWAS, for example, the West African bloc that should symbolize regional unity and defense. When Niger's military took a bold step towards sovereignty, it wasn't France that led the charge against them. It was ECOWAS, backed by France. Yes, African soldiers, prepared to fight another African nation, not to defend their people, but to uphold the interests of former colonizers. Even worse, Ivory Coast, once a proud nation of resistance, is now reportedly working alongside French operatives and Burkinabe traders, plotting to destabilize Burkina Faso, a country fighting not for conquest, but for survival, for dignity, for independence. This is the Africa we face today, an Africa where alliances are fractured, where loyalty to old empires outweighs solidarity with neighbors, where betrayal comes not from abroad, but from within. And yet, not all is lost. In a moment of profound reflection, President John Mahama reminded the world of what real Pan-Africanism looks like. He recalled a time when Ghana's freedom wasn't celebrated with isolation, but with a call to action. In 1957, he wrote, "The year before my birth, Ghana became the first Black African country to free itself from colonialism. After the Union Jack had been lowered, our first Prime Minister, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, gave a speech in which he emphasized that our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." Those words weren't just poetic, they were prophetic. Because Nkrumah knew, freedom for one African nation means little if others remain in chains. Mahama's reminder is not just about history, it's about the urgent need to reclaim the spirit of unity that once electrified the continent. In today's fractured Africa, only a few nations have truly become each other's bellwether. But the vision is clear, a continent where no African leader stands alone, where no country is left to fight its battles in the dark, and where sovereignty isn't a solo pursuit, but a shared mission. Then came 1960, and with it, tragedy. In South Africa, the Sharpeville massacre shook the world. 69 black South Africans gunned down, over 100 more wounded, unarmed, peaceful, protesters of apartheid, thousands of miles away, in Ghana. The response was immediate. We marched, we protested, we sheltered the exiled and spoke for the silenced. And we weren't alone. From Accra to Algiers, sovereign African nations rose in solidarity, because the people being murdered in the streets of South Africa looked like us, because the pain of apartheid was not distant, it was familiar. We had faced our own versions of that same battle, and we knew their struggle was ours. It was a moment of continental consciousness, a time when Africa stood tall, shoulder to shoulder, with a shared fire in its soul. It was the last time Africa was truly awake. But then, silence, division, disillusionment. The decades that followed saw that fire dim, smothered by external control and internal betrayal. Africa fragmented. The dream faded. Until now. With the rise of President Ibrahim Traoré and the AES alliance, something extraordinary is happening. A new generation of African leadership is defying the old order, unapologetic, unshaken, unafraid. They're not asking for permission. They're not begging for aid. They are lighting a fire, one that is spreading fast from the Sahel to the southern tip of the continent. This is the rebirth of African unity. And if we guard that flame, if we protect it with truth, courage, and unwavering solidarity, then maybe, just maybe, Africa will never fall asleep again. President Mahama didn't hold back. He reminded the world that South Africa's liberation wasn't handed over peacefully, it was fought for, and that fight was brutal. Thousands died. Many of them were children. Young lives cut short by bullets, by batons, by a system built on legalized racial hatred, a system so deeply rooted, so meticulously enforced, that it took decades of global protests, economic sanctions, and international outrage to finally bring it down. And yet, even as apartheid fell, the scars never truly healed. As Mahama said, it is the blood of the fallen and of their ancestors that soaks the soil of South Africa, a land freed, but never truly repaired. Because the truth is, the international community never paid a price. Not one Western power has offered reparations. Not for apartheid, not for colonization, not for the centuries of plunder and subjugation that built their modern wealth. And South Africa still bears the burden. Decades after apartheid's so-called end, white South Africans, less than 10% of the population, control over 70% of the nation's wealth. In some areas, there are still gated enclaves where only white South Africans can own land, run businesses, and build futures. Entire communities, off limits by race, in 2025. Let that sink in. Apartheid might be off the books, but it still lives in the bones of the nation. And yet, we hear no outrage from President Trump, no tweets from Elon Musk, no grand declarations about injustice, no calls for reparations or reform. Is it ignorance? Or is silence more convenient? Because when injustice favors the powerful, speaking up becomes optional. But when it threatens their narrative, suddenly it becomes a crisis. This is the double standard Africa knows all too well, and President Mahama is done pretending it doesn't exist. If you need proof that apartheid's legacy still lives on in South Africa, look no further than Kleinfontein, a secluded white-only community with a chilling landmark at its entrance. A massive bust of Hendrik Verwoerd, the former prime minister often called the architect of apartheid. That statue isn't just history, it's a symbol of pride for the people who live there. It tells us everything we need to know. They see nothing wrong with apartheid. They don't reject it, they honor it. And they're not alone. In the town of Orania, things are even more surreal. It's a separatist enclave where only white South African students are allowed in the schools. They don't even use the national currency. Instead, they print and use their own, the aura. And inside their cultural history museum, you'll find a bust of every apartheid-era president, except F.W. de Klerk, the only one who dared to end the system. The message is loud and clear. Apartheid didn't fail them. Reform did. And yet, These communities are thriving, peaceful, untouched. So if white South Africans are truly being persecuted, if there's truly a white genocide happening, why aren't these places under attack? Why are the very people who claim they're in danger seeking refugee status in the US instead of moving to Orania or Kleinfontein, places built to protect them by their own? The truth is hard to swallow, but undeniable. There is no genocide. There are no massacres. What we're witnessing is not a humanitarian crisis. It's a manufactured myth, a dangerous narrative designed to provoke fear, rewrite history, and once again cast Africans as the villains in their own homeland. As both President Mahama and Julius Malema have pointed out, if Black South Africans truly wanted revenge, they had every opportunity decades ago, when the wounds of apartheid were still fresh, when grief, anger, and injustice still clung to the air like smoke. But they didn't. Not then. Not even when the scars were still bleeding. There were no coordinated attacks, no campaigns of retaliation. Black South Africans didn't seek to destroy. They chose to rebuild. So why now? What sense would it make for a generation that has long since moved past vengeance to suddenly turn violent? This is the very question President Mahama is directing at the Trump administration. Because if there was no so-called white genocide in the turbulent aftermath of apartheid, what logic supports the claim that one is happening now? In fact, according to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, nearly half of South Africa's population is under the age of 29. These are young people, born after apartheid, raised in a new South Africa, and presumably committed to building a nation that includes everyone. They didn't grow up under the heel of segregation, but with the hope of the rainbow nation that Nelson Mandela dreamed of. So again, we ask, why would this generation, with no living memory of that system, suddenly rise up in genocidal hatred? It's a question the West has yet to answer, and it's one that shatters the false narrative being pushed by those who benefit from division, fear, and distortion. The story of South Africa isn't one of revenge. It's one of restraint, forgiveness, and the long, hard road toward equality. As President Mahama made clear, Trump's claims weren't just political blunders, they were deliberate. A calculated attempt to craft a narrative about Black people, that we are inherently violent, unstable, and dangerous. But beyond that, Trump's agenda was far more sinister. He sought to rewrite Africa's history, to tamper with our collective memory, because to distort memory is to control identity. That's why President Mahama invoked the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. If you want to destroy a people, he once said, you destroy their memory, you destroy their history. Mahama reminded the world that African memory is not easily erased. It runs deep, through bloodlines, through generations. The trauma of slavery, colonization, and apartheid is encoded into our very being. It lives in our stories, in our music, in our language, in our rituals, and in every whispered tale told in the kitchen, the church, the classroom, the barbershop, and the marketplace. And that memory, it is our strength. Yet there are still voices, mostly from the West, urging Africans to forget, to move on, to stop talking about the transatlantic slave trade, about colonization, about the theft and the brutality. They say the past should stay in the past, but what they really mean is that they don't want to be reminded. They want silence, not healing. But to forget the past is not peace, it is erasure. To forget is to lose the very identity that was stolen and fought for. For a continent like Africa, whose people were once told their culture was inferior, their history irrelevant, and their language uncivilized, remembering is an act of resistance. And today, as attempts to rewrite our story resurface, led by powerful figures like Trump, President Mahama's message could not be clearer. Africa will not forget. Africa will not be silenced. And Africa will not allow its history to be rewritten by those who never cared to understand it in the first place. Africa must return to its roots, or the struggle will only deepen. That's the truth few are willing to say out loud. One of the greatest tragedies facing the continent today is the quiet erasure of history from our schools. History, which should have been a core subject, the foundation of national identity and consciousness, has been sidelined or completely removed. And without it, how can Africa truly understand itself? How can it learn from the past or evolve beyond it? You see, when the colonial masters first arrived on African shores, Their mission wasn't just to take land or resources, it was to take control of the African mind. Their first strategy was subtle but devastating. They convinced entire communities that their own languages, cultures, and traditions were primitive, that to be African was to be less than human. Then, they replaced it all with foreign languages, foreign religions, and foreign systems of thought. French, Portuguese, English. These became the new tongues. Western schools, backed by Christian missionaries, became the tools. But these schools weren't built to empower. They were built to indoctrinate. Colonial education didn't teach Africans how to build. It taught them how to obey. It didn't promote self-reliance. It promoted dependency. Even today, our education systems still echo that colonial framework. We teach theories with no application. We memorize Western concepts but rarely learn the practical tools needed to industrialize, to innovate, to manufacture, or to modernize. And that's not by accident. If African schools had been built to truly educate, to truly liberate, independence would have come much earlier than the 1960s. It wasn't until World War II, when African soldiers were drafted into battle, traveled the world, and saw life beyond the colony, that the first serious sparks of resistance began. It was through exposure, not education, that Africans realized they'd been lied to, and that they could fight back. The time has come to break that cycle, to revive our history, to teach our children who they are, where they come from, and what was stolen from them. Because without memory, there is no direction. And without direction, Africa will always be walking someone else's path. In colonial and post-colonial classrooms, Africans were, and still are, taught to reject who they are, to distrust their languages, to be ashamed of their customs, to see their traditions as backward, and their own people as inferior. The white man's knowledge was positioned as superior, unquestionable, divine even. The colonial master left, but the mess they made remained. Ethnic tensions, language divisions, civil wars, political instability, and it all traces back to one fatal assumption, that African societies could be dismantled, restructured, and stitched back together without consequences. Until Africa reclaims its true identity, until education systems teach African children to respect their roots, languages, and cultures, we will continue to struggle with borders that don't reflect who we are and systems that were never built for our benefit. It's time to revive African consciousness, because only when we remember who we are can we build the Africa we were meant to become.
Just emphasizing on importance of passing a torch to the next generation, so that the Black community can have representation, and the Black community can have people who speak up for and teach them about the importance of their own importance.
Right.
My question today is, the diaspora of African Americans in America is, we're growing exponentially, and you named Barack Obama, you named Malcolm X, and I'm going to name you, Minister Louis Farrakhan. These are all, men, representations. As a people, sometimes we look to our representations and forget to represent ourselves. So we put all the energy, all the power, all the burden on the representation. And then when the representation, I don't like to say the word die, disappear, it's like, oh, what do we do now? Martin's dead. Who's the next representation? Oh, Malcolm's dead. Who's the next representation? So on and so forth. So as a people, how do we better represent ourselves and not always, shift the burden of representation always to a specific figure, except for unilaterally doing it as one people?
Thank you so much. Beautiful. I got chills, brother. Our future is safe with men like you. I thank God for your question, and I thank God for you.
people who build on a system of lies are always afraid of those people who bring the truth to light, right? And he talked about us looking at what they did to Malcolm X and the people, his likes, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, And I'm like, I ask myself, what would have happened if such men in the Black community were allowed, you understand, were allowed to even dare be people of their own and influence a mass and see where that goes and what they build.
But you know that is why the powers that be had them unalived, because they really did not want the Black community having such strong leaders who would tap into the maximum potential of the Black community, because they need the Black community to stay under their rule. And then on another thing, the white community fears Black people coming into power because they are afraid, very much afraid of what Black people would do to them when they come into power. Because a person who tells a lie will always know the kind of lies they've told. And also, an evil person will always know what they've done against you, right? And that is why this evil person fears when you have the power of advantage, you will do the exact same thing to them. But you know what I've come to realize with the Black community is not a big percentage of Black community, they're not vengeful. They just want to exist and they just want to be left alone, in short.
Yeah. And you also look at, guys, okay, just allow me to give you an example of what's happening in Africa. You look at a man like Ibrahim Traore.
Good example.
I feel like right now he's currently the best example we can talk about. While the liars in the West are talking about how Africa is too poor to even pay their debts. They're talking about how Africa cannot survive without getting
West.
loans.
Right. And also they're talking about, I heard somewhere that Ibrahim Traore was being called a cult leader and that Africans were being bewitched by the influence of Ibrahim Traore.
And these are the kind of lies we normally talk about. And you know, it's not a surprise that they've tried taking him out more than 20 times, because they do not, once I feel like that hope, that somebody that brings that hope to the Black community is considered an enemy because
and a threat.
Because whatever Ibrahim Traore is doing right now, assuming we had someone in the Caribbean and someone in the Black American community who was doing such impactful things to the point where the world was noticing and it was benefiting the Black community.
Yeah, and furthermore, it's only interesting the Black community, but it is not aligning with the interest of the West, because as we said, the West needs Africans, the West needs Black Americans to stay under their rule, because this is how they get ahead.
Yeah, and I would say a long time ago it was very, very easy to spread propaganda or to spread propaganda to the Black communities. It doesn't matter if it's America or right. It was very easy for them to do that because the only source of information or discerning information was the mainstream media, and they owned that. But right now, I do believe that they're facing a real challenge, because things like social media came with its own challenges for them, because at least people could be right now are able to hear from the horse's mouth. They don't necessarily have to hear what the West is saying. And right now, even if you're choosing to unalive someone because they're the truth sayers or they're the people who are bringing the torch or the light to other Black communities, are you going to be taking care of all these people across the world? Right now, I feel like people like Martin Luther King don't necessarily have to look they don't necessarily have to pass information in the same way it used to be in the past. Right now, just the simple access to internet and the simple way of influencing people. If you realize you command a very big crowd and you just decide to speak about a topic, that is how you're gonna touch a lot of lives. So right now, it's I feel like these things are happening differently. Although I do believe also when they want to get you, they'll still get you. Yeah.
The fact is that his big kill on the Black people is the millions of people that he's allowed to come in through the border. They're taking Black jobs now, and it could be 18, it could be 19, and even 20 million people. They're taking Black jobs, and they're taking Hispanic jobs, and you haven't seen it yet, but you're going to see something that's going to be the worst in our history. Today, our cities are flooded with illegal aliens. Americans are being squeezed out of the labor force and their jobs are taken. And by the way, you know who's taking the jobs that are created? 107% of those jobs are taken by illegal aliens. And you know who's being hurt the most by millions of people pouring into our country? The black population and the Hispanic population, because they're taking the jobs from our black population, our Hispanic population.
Virtually 100% of the net job creation in the last year has gone to migrants. You know that?
You just heard Donald Trump claim that virtually all jobs last year went to migrants. And Trump didn't just stop there. Let's watch him do some more math. Take a look.
Most of the job creation has gone to migrants. In fact, I've heard that substantially more than beyond the number of 100%. It's a much higher number than that, but the government hasn't caught up with that yet. But virtually right now, as of the time they did this, virtually 100% of the net job creation in the last year has gone to migrants.
But I mean, you know, he just says stuff. He just says things. You know, if migrants took 100% of the jobs, then Americans just aren't getting hired. It's not a lot of people complaining about that. Are migrants also getting corporate jobs that they clearly don't qualify for? Or are they in, like, what are you talking about? How can MAGA really believe this? I don't, you know, sure, you have your true believers who will just take anything he says at face value, but there's no way that people are listening to this and thinking he's telling the truth.
You know, I just realized what he meant by black and brown jobs as you were explaining that. I mean, color me naive on this one because I didn't get what he was referring to. I just thought he was just being a weirdo like he usually is, right? But as you said, like corporate jobs, I was like, oh, he means low income jobs. Like the migrants aren't coming in and becoming corporate CEOs. They're taking low income jobs, and those in his mind are black and brown jobs.
Of course.
He's such a bad guy.
Look, I want to talk about why you're here today. I mean, it is not lost on us how divided we are as a country. And as you were coming today, we really got to see that we are divided along the lines of race, along the lines of gender. And there is this question of, in this moment where we are, why come here? What is your message today?
My message is to stop people from invading our country that are taking, frankly, a lot of problems with it. But one of the big problems, and a lot of the journalists in this room I know and I have great respect for, a lot of the journalists in this room are black. I will tell you that coming from the border are millions and millions of people that happen to be taking black jobs. You had the best.
What exactly is a black job, sir?
A black job is anybody that has a job. That's what it is. Anybody that has a job.
All right.
And
Mr.
they're taking the employment away from black people. They're coming in, they're invading. It's an invasion of millions of people, probably 15, 16, 17 million people. I have a feeling it's much more than that. And everybody's been seeing what's happened. The first group of people, the black population, is affected most by that. These people are coming into our country and they're taking black jobs and Hispanic jobs.
Trigger warning. The following program is meant for both white and black audiences and every other color imaginable.
It's 1870. The Civil War and its bloody liberation is still a fresh memory. The embers of the Confederation are smoldering in the South. The nation is more divided than ever. And years after emancipation, the African American community is beginning to thrive. Hiram Revels, born free, family established in the Americas long before the Revolution. He was a preacher, an educator, who planted schools for black children across the U.S. But on February 15th, 1870, Revels would make history. Spectators packed the galleries and burst into applause as Hiram Revels entered the chamber to take his oath as the first African-American senator in U.S. history.
Revels wasn't alone. He was a part of a wave of 2,000 black men elected to public office across the South.
a wave that would soon be crushed. The Civil War had exposed an insidious code in America's DNA, a blueprint of power and control, labor and division.
For some hidden history. This code didn't just create laws. It created an entire race of people.
The first time
It created the greed, the division, and the privilege that has always ruled America. This is the story of America's Black Codes.
Somebody told a lie one day. All power to the people.
The lies told in history books.
A group of families dared to cross a mighty ocean to build a future for themselves in a new world.
The first permanent English settlement in the Americas was done by a corporation.
America began with corporations, plantations, and cheap labor. Remember that.
The Virginia Company of London was established in 1607, and they were commissioned by King James himself. There was no Mayflower, there was no religious freedom seekers. Their mission was to find gold and loot the Indians. They didn't find the gold that they were searching for. What they did find was a business model that would endure in the Americas from its inception to present day.
The plantation system in the United States. Cheap labor, one crop, and vast tracts of land.
Slavery wasn't institutionalized in the colonies in the early 1600s, but they still desperately needed a labor force. And the English, they grabbed the poor, the vagrants, the criminals, and they shipped them off to the New World, along with the Irish, the Polish, and a small but growing number of Africans, all into indentured servitude contracts. And if you don't know what an indentured servant is,
indentured servants were generally white people coming from Europe.
I might not survive it. That master, he can do with me what he wants. I don't work hard enough, he can beat me. If he doesn't like the way I work, he can sell me.
After nearly a decade, the king gave permission for the English Governor General to collect and sell the captured Irish soldiers as slaves and send them to the New World in the Americas.
Now, the people of the servant class, they were all equals. Generally speaking, they were built to benefit the elites of Jamestown and its shareholders, corporations, plantations, and cheap labor.
Free men of African descent could own servants or slaves, and they did. They could vote, and they did. They could marry persons of the opposite sex regardless of national origin, and they did.
1621. A young man is running for his life off the shores of West African Angola. He's eventually captured, overpowered, and subdued. Life as he knows it is snatched away from him right at that moment. His family, his friends, religion, vocation is all left behind. A vacancy in Africa.
This man would come to be known as Anthony Johnson, now an indentured servant for the Virginia Company of London, but soon to be the patriarch of the first community of wealthy black property owners in America.
When he arrived at the tobacco plantation, all of the people working alongside him were of a lighter complexion. They were European, English, Irish, Polish, and they all worked side by side with each other as indentured servants in the tobacco fields of Virginia. All these different nationalities getting together, getting along. No racial divide, no social divide, working side by side with each other, sleeping in the same barracks, eating at the same tables, no problems whatsoever. For now. Anthony Johnson lived a fulfilling, full life. After his indentured servitude, he got his land, he sued Europeans, he purchased white and black slaves, and at a time when status was tied to wealth and wealth was tied to land, Anthony owned over 300 acres of land. It's apparent that race was not a discriminating tool early in the colonial times. I wonder what happened.
"Lay it level with the ground!" yelled Nathaniel Bacon. And they did. Jamestown was burned to the ground after the multiracial mob slaughtered their way along a bloody path. They turned their rage on Jamestown, the political and financial seat of the colony, The rebellion was an overflow from a simmering pot of extreme abuses the working class tolerated.
The poor all came together.
The elites saw this. They understood that a unified poor class was a problem. The shareholders expressed extreme concern over Bacon's rebellion. The Virginia lawmakers replied, not to worry, and that they'll be pursuing a divide and conquer strategy. With this strategy came a completely new social class, one that lowered Africans to a subhuman status.
While it elevated the social status of a new race of people, they did all this by implementing some different statutes and codes that would infamously come to be known as the Black Code.
These are some of the very first laws that we see targeted towards a whole group of people.
No attending funerals or any other group gatherings. No self-defense of any kind. 20 lashes on your bare back if you leave the plantation without permission. 30 lashes if you ever lift a hand against a white Christian. But white servants had it a little better. They could gain their freedom. They wouldn't be owned by non-white people. And black people would have to submit to all white people, no matter their authority. This was the beginning of the American caste system.
The law of 1681 represents the first time on planet Earth that there is a reference to a group of humanity called white people.
How did your ancestors get turned into white people?
I have no idea. I honestly have no idea.
How did English people and German people get turned into white people?
Came to America.
Great-grandfather came here from Russia in 1910. He had to give up what it meant to be a Jew, a Russian Jew from Eastern Europe. The Irish had to do the same thing. The Italians had to do the same thing.
The Virginia Company of London would pass several laws to grant privileges to white people and force Africans into a slavery caste.
1681.
Because whiteness has never existed until
the
1681.
For nearly 200 years, black codes spread across the country, attempting to strip African Americans of their humanity and establishing a deeply entrenched caste system, a racial hierarchy fiercely defended by Southern Confederates.
There is no South without slavery.
As the war raged on,
during General Sherman's Scorched Earth campaign in the South, he met with a few African American ministers, and he wanted to ask them one thing. What could he do to help them transition from this life of slavery to this new life of being freed men? And they came to a consensus.
What do you want? What do you want from us? And he says, we want land and we want education.
the 13th Amendment liberated black folk all over the USA in 1865. But what it didn't do was offer any protections or rights for those individuals. And President Johnson refused to offer any protection to black people or any rights. In fact, around every single corner and turn, he vetoed and hampered any progress for black Americans.
When you go to the 13th Amendment, one of the fascinating things about the text of that amendment is that it says that slavery is abolished, except in the case of a punishment for a crime.
So here's what they did in the South. They criminalized being black. They reintroduced the black codes.
A whole category of new statutes passed in almost every southern state that attached these enormous penalties to what were in reality very minor. Those were laws that were only ever enforced against African Americans.
And these black codes were a way for the South to get a lot of labor. This is the system that ushered in convict leasing.
Convict leasing was a brutal system where the state made enormous profits by leasing out prisoners, but the real financial windfall went to the private corporations and the plantations that exploited the cheap labor. While the state collected fees, companies like Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, U.S. Steel, Sloss Furnace, Pratt Coal and Coke Company, and untold numbers of plantations made exponentially more by using convicts to fuel their industries, pick their cotton, build their railroads, mine their coal, and produce their iron. This system turned human suffering into massive corporate profits. Workers were literally worked to death and quickly replaced with another convict.
In 1866, Congress gained control of the House and the Senate, and they would go on to pass a litany of civil rights bills. The 14th and 15th Amendment would be added, and they would release an instrumental piece of legislation that would change life in the South forever, something called the Reconstruction Acts. These acts released a military occupation of the South to ensure the rights of the newly freed and liberated black citizens. This marked the beginning of an era that would never be matched again. In 1865, 8% of black people were registered to vote. By 1867, 80% of black people were registered to vote, and they exercised their rights.
Blacks turned out in huge numbers at voting stations all over the South. But it wasn't just about politics. This was about revolution. Thousands of schools were built, HBCUs all over the South. For the first time ever, black children and adults walked into classrooms, eager to learn and eager to level up. It wasn't just about education either. With the skill set came jobs, and with jobs came financial freedom. We're talking about black families taking control of their own future. Shout out to Madam C.J. Walker, who would soon become America's first self-made female millionaire. Meanwhile, black men are diving deep into politics, shaping laws, building schools, and protecting black communities. This was a time when black families thrived. Faith, economics, education, and politics. 1898. Wilmington, North Carolina, was a multiracial hub of progressive life. The predominantly black city thrived, where the docks were overflowing with lucrative activity, and the city's factories and businesses were all doing very well.
35 years removed from slavery, and the residents of this town were successful by most measures. The political party in power were the Fusionists, who were a unique political coalition of poor white farmers and black citizens, and they dominated the political scene. They took the majority of seats in both 1894 and 1896 elections.
Something had to change, and a group of Democrats met to formulate a plan. It all came together in their Democratic Handbook of 1898, where they explicitly stated their goals and plans to consolidate the white vote by inciting white anger and resentment. It said, quote, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it." Charles Aycock and Josephus Daniels of the News and Observer got together to create a campaign. They would flood the media with racist cartoons and propaganda in the spring, summer, and fall of 1898, framing the Fusionist government as a Negro-dominating, incompetent threat to white supremacy. They exploited the national narrative that viewed black men as a predator to white women's virtues and incited white anger to mobilize voters. We are sitting with the J. Jenkins, Esquire. I believe you are the president right now, co-founder and president of Convict Lease Labor Project down in Texas, right?
Yes, sir. The Texas economy before emancipation relied on free labor. And when you know the story of convict leasing, this brief period where the state leased prison farms out to private companies, this specific convict leasing, when the black codes were passed, this convict leasing era, the whole timeline makes so much sense. Modern day prison slavery that's still occurring in Texas, the only thing that changed was the state saw how much money these private corporations were making off the prison labor and said, hell no, we're not going to give that to private companies anymore. We should keep that in-house. And so today, Texas Corrections Incorporated is a provider of some of the finest office furniture to county governments across the state. They raise and feed livestock, all of it in Texas done by prisoners that is unpaid still today.
Texas Correctional Industries originated in 1912, $77 million in profit, in addition to the cost savings of utilizing inmate labor.
$76.7 million profit. Not earnings, not revenue, profit.
Texas Correctional Industries is one of several for-profit, state-run prison corporations, turning people into literally slaves of the state. They bring in billions of dollars worth of profits every year, and they always have. Slavery never ended.
I have picked cotton off the cotton plant. Texas Department of Criminal Justice, you pick cotton off the cotton plant.
The state of Alabama is making more than $450 million each year by forcing inmates to work outside prison walls.
It kind of appears that there is a coordinated system in order to protect the labor that's created by the prison system.
Since emancipation, the Black Codes have created a billion-dollar business of punishment for many of the Confederate states, with many housed on plantations and still picking cotton. Despite having 4% of the global population, the U.S. holds nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. Though African Americans only make up 13% of the U.S.'s total population, blacks make up 38% of the prison population. And here's why.
Because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
Now, according to one of Nixon's top aides,
"You want to know what this was really all about?" Ehrlichman said to the reporter. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Incarceration rates began to skyrocket. And then along came Reagan.
Restore hope, and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again.
Except he made things much worse.
Here's what happened.
Reagan took Nixon's wager and doubled down against black people and against the poor, and caused more hardship in the black community with legislation specifically targeting black and brown communities.
Today, it gives me great pleasure to sign legislation that reflects the total commitment of the American people and their government to fight the evil of drugs.
In all black and brown communities across America, drug use, violent crimes, and poverty skyrocketed under the Reagan administration.
Drugs were bad, fried your brain.
Just say no.
No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America.
Black youth were demonized on the nightly news. Drug addicts were condemned, and the prisons were filled.
We passed, on a bipartisan basis, a law that imposed 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine offenses. That legislation has directly fueled the crisis of mass incarceration in America. In America, we pride ourselves as the land of the free, but the sad fact is we have the highest incarceration rate in the world.
From the creation of white people as an ethnic group to the creation of the multi-billion-dollar prison industrial complex that we know today,
dividing and manipulating the American people is a legacy as old as corporations,
plantations,
and cheap labor.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, Donald Trump just got some bad news at the hands of a Republican judge. Can you explain what just happened in court?
Yeah, Brian, yet another ruling from a Ronald Reagan-appointed judge who's been on the bench for 40 years, declaring that Donald Trump's executive orders are illegal, unconstitutional, and void. And I'll tell you, I don't know that I have seen a judge go quite so scorched earth in his language on Donald Trump, and I'll get to that in a minute. But Donald Trump issued two executive orders revoking funding for research, and these were with the National Institute of Health, the NIH, for two groups of people, racial minorities and LGBTQ plus folks. And this judge, William Young, a federal court judge up in Massachusetts, not only declared that Donald Trump's executive orders targeting these two groups of people were unconstitutional. But Brian, I'll tell you, I can't do justice to Judge Young's outrage without reading three very short quotes The first one, the judge says, quote, "I have never seen a record where racial discrimination was so palpable. I've sat on this bench for 40 years now. I've never seen government racial discrimination like this." Quote number 2, "I am hesitant to draw this conclusion, but I have an unflinching obligation to draw it that this represents racial discrimination and discrimination against LGBTQ community. That's what this is. I would be blind not to call it out. My duty is to call it out." And one last quote from Judge Young, quote, "You are bearing down on people of color because of their color. The Constitution will not permit that. Have we fallen so low? Have we no shame?" That's some of the choice quotes from this Reagan-appointed judge about Donald Trump's unconstitutional executive orders.
How unusual or unorthodox is that kind of language from a judge, notwithstanding the fact that he was a Republican-appointed judge, and so it's going to be difficult for the party of Reagan to be able to circle that square. But just in general, how often do we see that kind of language?
Brian, it is extraordinarily rare. For 30 years, I appeared before judges in the military, in civilian courts, in state courts, in federal courts, in trial courts, and in appellate courts. And people may not know, in the courts of Washington, D.C., not only are all of the federal court judges appointed by the president, but the 65 judges who sit on D.C.'s local court, the Superior Court for the District of Columbia, are also all presidentially appointed judges because D.C. is a federal city and not a state. I have probably appeared before more federal court judges than almost anybody else. I mean, I can't prove that empirically, but it's pretty damn close. Judges don't talk this way. Yeah. Even when lawyers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, civil practitioners make outrageous claims or outrageous arguments, judges don't talk this way. They're thoughtful, they're measured, they're circumspect. Even the most irascible judges tend to kind of pull back a little bit. They don't use language like that. But when you have a veteran of the federal courts for 40 years who says, listen, this is my duty. It's my duty to call this exactly what it is, blatant racial discrimination by our government, by the Trump administration, and blatant discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community. You know, what has pushed him to do that, just as other judges have done, is just how brazenly unlawful and unconstitutional Donald Trump's conduct is. Based on what we're hearing from some of the White House spokespeople, I am certain they're going to appeal it because they're spewing out the same old garbage. Oh, this judge is biased. This judge is using his own political views and ideology to attack Donald Trump, which kind of makes no damn sense given that he was appointed by Ronald Reagan. So
I mean that's something that they throw out every opportunity they get.
But, you know, of course, every judge that rules against Donald Trump, and they're ruling against him by the estimate of one political scientist from Stanford, 96% of the time, they are not only Republican-appointed, Democrat-appointed judges, but they're Trump-appointed judges. You know, all Donald Trump and his mouthpieces have is to attack them as lunatics and deranged, which really, I don't even know that fools the gullible at this point. Not only will the Trump administration want to appeal, but they'll want to file for an emergency stay. How many times have we danced this dance? And, first, Judge Young will have the opportunity to decide whether he wants to stay or pause his own ruling. I'm suspecting he won't. And then Trump will run up to the appeals court and ask the appeals court to put a temporary, even if only administrative, stay, which has nothing to do with the sort of quality of Judge Young's ruling. It's just sort of a temporary hold while the appeals court gets to decide the issue. So I am sure that, we've seen this movie before, and I'm sure that is the way this one will play out as well.
The longtime deference that these judges have paid to the Department of Justice, because usually the Department of Justice acts in good faith and oftentimes doesn't even take cases that it's not going to win. But in this case, when we're seeing a Department of Justice and an administration that has so quickly burned through all of its goodwill by virtue of all the illegality and corruption that they're trafficking in, does that change the calculus a little bit for these judges, where instead of kind of the default position being deference to this administration, now they have to think about the fact that this administration is not acting in good faith and is trafficking in so much illegality that maybe deference should be paid to the folks who fight against this administration?
I think the answer is yes. I think the Department of Justice, as you said, has squandered its good faith. You know, the judges ordinarily will look at federal prosecutors and believe that they are acting in good faith. They have the evidence to back up the assertions they make in court. They have the law on their side. They actually are taking care not to trample over the rights of the people that are enshrined in the Constitution. They have squandered that, you know. And just as the Department of Justice ordinarily runs around pounding its chest that they, you know, win 99% of the time, albeit in criminal cases, they talk about having a 99% conviction rate, even in civil matters. The Department of Justice wins in the overwhelming majority of the cases. But when you start going into court as a DOJ lawyer and making just purely bullshit arguments, and the judges see right through them, you know, your goodwill is gone. And when you're losing 96% of the time, that has to impact the way a judge will sort of approach each case when it has to do with an allegation of Trump administration illegality.
And finally, let's finish off with this. We know that the issue at hand here are health-related grants. And so obviously there is some degree of urgency in making sure that this is restored.
Yeah, and Judge Young actually made a comment that, you know, this impacts the health of two populations in a discriminatory manner, minorities and the LGBTQ+ community. So I have a feeling we're probably going to see within about 24 hours the Trump administration seeking both a stay and filing a notice of appeal.
Okay, well, you know, first of all, be on the lookout for the Trump administration attacking yet another liberal, communist, Marxist judge that was appointed by Ronald Reagan, basically the father of the modern GOP. You're watching The Legal Breakdown.
Let's face it, it is not normal to call up our troops in this way, and there is active litigation against this deployment. Will you follow a court's order regarding whether or not this deployment is legal? If the court says this deployment of troops into our cities is not legal, would you follow that court's order?
It's pending in the courts, Senator.
Well, when the court decides, would you follow that court's order decision?
I don't believe district courts should be determining national security policy.
So you will not be following that.
When it goes to the Supreme Court, we'll see.
Court. And unless the president decides to appeal, there you have it. So I take it that you don't consider district court decisions to be legitimate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If the Supreme Court orders you to remove troops from American cities, will you do so?
As I've said, Senator, I don't believe district courts should determine national security policy, but if the Supreme Court rules on a topic, we will abide by that.
Okay. You know, during her press conference last week, Secretary Noem said, "We are staying here to liberate the city from its mayor and its governor, people who were elected by a majority of voters." Secretary Hegseth is saying he is ready to deploy more troops and won't tell us what the implications are for our national defense. This is un-American and it makes us unsafe. I wish our Republican colleagues would speak up.
Donald Trump's first 100 days in office have been a whirlwind. He's signed executive orders. He's held chaotic press conferences. He's defied court orders and even made at least one car ad.
Everything's computer.
I don't want to focus on the random stuff. I want to focus on patterns. A specific pattern that comes with a label that has been following Donald Trump for decades. Racist. A New York City housing discrimination lawsuit in the 70s to rumors of frequent N-word use on the set of The Apprentice. He's given his critics plenty to debate over. But whether or not Trump is a bigot on a personal level is irrelevant to me. I'm not here to psychoanalyze him. I don't care what's in his heart or what's on his mind. What I care about is what's on the record. Policy, action, power. So in this video, I want to look at exactly that, the documented, captured, explicit, and implicit acts of bigotry during Trump's first 100 days. The independent media organization Contraband Camp did an incredible job of putting together a list of some of the questionable, if not outright racist actions taken by this administration since they took office on January 20, 2025. I was inspired to make this video because of their report. But in order to effectively track the Trump administration's bigoted actions, they also put together a simple three-part methodology. First, their report focuses on the impact of his policies. That is, the effects that they will have on specific communities. Second, they chronicled the policies that were designed to reverse protections against discrimination, what they're calling reverse racism. And third, they used the Merriam-Webster definitions of the words discrimination and racism as a grounding for how they defined what was and wasn't racist from this administration. I think their report is spot on. So without further ado, this is Trump's first 100 days, racism edition. Let's dig in. Day number 1. Just hours after Trump's inauguration, Elon Musk performs what looks like a Nazi salute behind the official seal of the President of the United States of America. 6 million Jewish people were exterminated at the command of people who did this exact same salute. And yet the ADL makes an excuse for Musk. That same day, Trump signs a host of executive orders, like Executive Order 14151, which terminates all DEI-related programs in the federal government, or Executive Order 14160, which seeks to end birthright citizenship for people born in America. He also signs Executive Order 14164, which calls the death penalty an essential tool. On that exact same day, he rescinds a ton of orders, like Executive Order 13985, titled Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities. He rescinds Executive Order 14031, titled Advancing Equity, Justice, and Opportunity for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. He also rescinds Executive Order 14069, which promotes pay equity and transparency. Day 2, January 21st, 2025. Trump continues his attack on DEI, calling diversity, equity, and inclusion illegal discrimination without evidence. I made an entire video about this topic, so consider watching that one next. Day 3. Trump's Department of Justice halts all investigations into police misconduct and freezes all pending civil rights cases. It's important to note that almost every time the DOJ has investigated police departments across the country, they found rampant, verifiable examples of racist practices that almost always impact Black people specifically. And to freeze all pending civil rights cases means that they believe that there is either no discrimination in this country, or they simply do not care to bring justice for those who have been discriminated against. Day 7, Trump signs Executive Order 14185, titled Restoring America's Fighting Force. It ends DEI in the U.S. military and announces plans to target people who promote what the Trump administration calls gender ideology. Day 11, Trump blames an airline collision in D.C. on DEI, blaming Barack Obama and insinuating that mentally disabled people were somehow responsible as well. On the same day, Trump signs Executive Order 14190, titled Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling, which threatens to strip funding from K-12 schools that teach, quote, radical ideology. According to Contraband Camp, the curators of this list, the policy is cut and pasted from suspected white nationalist Christopher Rufo's definition of critical race theory. Under this rule, teaching about slavery, civil rights, and Jim Crow could be deemed illegal. Day 18. Trump signs an executive order to eradicate anti-Christian bias. It's pulled straight from Project 2025, and while it isn't explicitly about race, it narrowly defines Christianity within anti-trans and ostensibly anti-liberation terms. Day 22. February 10th, 2025. Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, makes good on Trump's promise to restore the names of bigots back to U.S. military bases. Fort Liberty's name is changed back to Fort Bragg, originally named after a Confederate traitor and enslaver, General Braxton Bragg. But the insane thing is that instead of standing on business, standing on their decision, they do this cowardly sidestep thing and found a random white man with the last name Bragg to maintain their plausible deniability. So to say that they aren't honoring the Confederacy, but we know what you are. We see what you're doing. Day 32. First, Trump purges the military of woke leadership. He fires 3 people that day: a black man, CQ Brown, and 2 white women. And he replaces all of them with lesser qualified white men. Next, Trump officially stops tracking police misconduct, ordering a national database be shut down. The history, policy, and practice of policing in America mean that police are more likely to brutalize, profile, and kill non-white Americans. We know this because of, you guessed it, tracking databases like the one he shut down. Day 40. Trump signs Executive Order 14224, designating English as the official language of the federal government, which is fine. I don't, sure. But he goes a step further, not just designating English as the official language. He also rescinds previous guidance to provide access to services for persons with limited English proficiency. This is racist and stupid and downright mean to someone's grandma who speaks English as her second language. Day 45. Trump signs Executive Order 14230, the first of several executive orders targeting law firms that were hired by his political enemies. What he's doing is illegal, but he justifies it by saying that the DEI policies at these firms are illegal. It's important to note that Black people make up about 5% of all lawyers in America. 5. White people, on the other hand, make up about 81% of all lawyers in America. But again, he cites a diversity fellowship at one particular law firm as the reason he is targeting them. And just a few weeks later, he would do the same thing to universities, stripping Harvard University of billions of dollars in federal funding for research and scholarships. Day 47. Mahmoud Khalil is arrested. Federal immigration authorities arrest a Palestinian activist who led some of Columbia University's student protests against the U.S.'s involvement in Israel's war with Hamas. Of note, Khalil has not been charged with a crime and was arrested for exercising his First Amendment rights. He is a political prisoner by definition, currently detained in a facility in Louisiana. Day 51 through 54. Immigration officials arrest and deport Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Just like Mahmoud Khalil, Abrego Garcia has not been convicted in a court of law, has not been charged with a crime, and has been denied due process based on the Trump administration's unsubstantiated claims that he is a member of a gang. To make matters worse, the Trump administration admitted that they made an administrative error in deporting Abrego Garcia, but then completely flipped their stance, deciding instead to defy multiple court orders to bring him back to the United States of America. Day 52, March 13th, 2025. Trump uses the term Palestinian as a slur or insult against Senator Chuck Schumer. In the same interview, he calls Senator Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas.
Pocahontas was very happy. She's the one that was slapped. That's why I looked at her and said, oh, it's Pocahontas.
A term that is seen as a slur for Native Americans. Day 53, March 14th, 2025. Trump guts the Minority Business Development Agency. Now, as some of you know, I spent a ton of time with Black Republicans last year, and several of them told me that they were excited for Trump because of his business mind, that he'd promised through the Platinum Plan to invest in minority-owned businesses specifically for Black people. Given Trump's attack on diversity and race-conscious policies, that seems unlikely now. Day 57. The Department of Defense continues a purge of Black history, getting rid of the bio for Jackie Robinson, among others. The erasure of Black history has been a central issue for Trump and his allies. And Contraband Camp reports that no white people were deleted in this DOD purge. Day 63. The Atlantic reveals that Pete Hegseth accidentally added their editor-in-chief to their War Plans Signal group chat. This wasn't racist. It was just one of the dumbest mistakes in American history, and we should never forget that it happened. Day 66. Speaking of history, Trump signs Executive Order 14253, titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. Among other things, the order seems to suggest that the official position of the Trump administration is that race is a biological reality, which is definitional racism. It is old school eugenics era racism and insane to me. For the record, race is a social construct, and the way we understand each other as racialized beings is a relatively new phenomenon in world history. Day 70. The Pentagon bans DEI books. They purged 381 books from the Naval Academy Library. And a significant number of these books are from Black authors, including Ibram Kendi, Emmanuel Acho, and Kimberly Jones. Day 84. Trump tells the president of El Salvador that he wants to deport, quote, homegrown U.S. citizens to foreign prisons. Given the ways that the U.S. legal system is stacked against non-white people, the outcomes of this illegal plan would no doubt have devastating impacts on Black and Hispanic communities specifically. Day 88. Donald Trump posts a photoshopped image of Kilmar Abrego Garcia's knuckle tattoos, claiming that it was proof that he is a member of the MS-13 gang. Not only does the image appear to be doctored, none of the 4 symbols on his knuckles in the photo, which were a marijuana symbol, a smiley face, a cross, and a skull, none of these symbols appear in any law enforcement database referencing the MS-13 gang. Perhaps more importantly, again, Abrego Garcia has been denied access to due process in a court of law. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that the Trump administration claimed that they mistakenly deported this man because of an administrative error, and then just days later started this public smear campaign. And now they're like doubling and tripling down on it. What's abundantly clear to me is that they believe that this man, his reputation, his rights, and his freedom are all disposable tokens in their political game. And I think they believe they can get away with this because he and all the other people that they've disappeared are non-white and therefore expendable. Day 94, and this is important. Trump signs an executive order to eliminate the federal use of disparate impact across various areas of civil rights enforcement, instead pushing for color blindness. It feels like we probably need to have more conversations about the logical fallacy in all of this color blindness stuff. This executive order completely undermines the government's ability to identify and rectify potential unequal impacts on communities. Disparate impact is especially useful for its ability to help uncover unintended consequences of seemingly neutral policies. Said simply, Trump removed the government's ability to even know which communities are harmed by the things that he's doing. If you were operating in good faith and you wanted what's best for everyone, wouldn't you want to know about the unintended, unintentional, harmful impacts of the things that you were doing? Well, now one of the tools used to determine exactly that is gone. At the time of this recording, there are still a few days left in Trump's first 100 days. I don't know or care if Donald Trump is a racist, but I think his actions have proven that he is completely okay with utilizing racism to stir up his base, to seize power, and to make a clear distinction between who is in and who is out.
This is going to offend the liberal elites. Every time I say it, it offends them. But let me say it one more time. America is not a racist country. No, we're not. But if you were looking for racism today, you'd find it in cities run by Democrats.
If I understand your words correctly, you do not believe that there is systemic racism in America.
Correct.
So I should check with you first
Yes.
on that.
I do not believe America is a racist country. I don't. I can expound, but it sounds like you have a question.
I do. So how does that intersect your belief with the rise in Asian hate crimes, the rise in white supremacy activities, and on a very personal and painful part for my own family, the rise in anti-Semitic attacks and the waving of Nazi flags?
Yeah. So thank you, Laura, for the question. I would simply say that America is not a racist country, period. I don't apologize for that conclusion. When asked the same question, my friends on the other side of the aisle who are running the country, kind of, sort of, came to the same conclusion. I'd say this, though, really important question. Is there racism in America? Of course there is. Are the systems of our country racist? I don't think so. But yeah, the rise in hate crimes in the nation is not indicative with the soul of America. We certainly have hot spots that we need to challenge. And so focusing on some of the challenges that we see is the right thing to do. I think it's our responsibility as the American people, the American family, to stand up when we see it and speak out against it, not just when it affects you, but when it affects any of us. And that's what I've tried to do with my legislation. I've done it with my words. I've done it with my social media accounts to stand up and speak out against it. But I don't think our nation is racist. I do think we have pockets that we have to fight, persistent pockets at times that we have to fight against and eliminate. I think we've done a really good job.
You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue.
Tim Scott is the only black senator in the Republican caucus, so he's like the default DEI guy. So after Trump's good people on both sides remarks, reporters were quick to ask him what he thought of the president's comments. And you may be surprised to learn that Tim Scott spoke in no uncertain terms about the president's statement.
I'm not going to defend the indefensible. His comments on Monday were strong. His comments on Tuesday started erasing the comments that were strong. What we want to see from our president is clarity and moral authority, and that moral authority is compromised when Tuesday happens. What we've seen is that moral authority being compromised by the lack of clarity, by what we have seen as the pivot backwards, which is very unsettling for many Americans, to include me.
And he didn't just stop there. He spoke with unbridled clarity that racism was a real issue in America.
We may have some challenges without any question. Racism is real, it is alive, it is here.
Looking back, this almost feels like a totally different person because clearly something has changed. This Tim Scott is disruptive. This Tim Scott is challenging the status quo.
America is not a racist country.
He goes on to point to his own personal success. Born into poverty, raised by a single mother.
My mom worked 16 hours a day to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads.
Yet, here he is, an American success story. And while his personal achievements are certainly worthy of celebration, this misdirection intentionally clouds the point that millions of black people have been trying to make for generations, which is that American systems, agencies, and businesses reliably contribute to negative, racist outcomes for black people. These are statistical facts, and the exploitation of black people specifically and poor people broadly is built into the incentives of this country. It shouldn't be hard for us to admit that America has room for improvement in this area. Our economy was in fact built on exploited labor. American systems aren't fair for black people in nearly every measurable way one can imagine. But to play the role of the magical Negro, one must not disrupt the status quo of the white protagonists, even when that status quo means the destruction of oneself or the communities that he claims to be helping. In 2017, Senator Scott spearheaded a corporate tax break called Opportunity Zones.
Opportunity zones. My signature legislation, the Opportunity Zones.
The headline for this program is that corporations would be incentivized to invest in low-income, presumably black communities to help create jobs and grow the economy in areas most investors would overlook.
This initiative that the president and I worked together on is now bringing more than $75 billion of private sector investment into distressed communities.
A New York Times investigation, however, found that this program did little to help people in the communities it was advertised to serve. For starters, the program's Opportunity Zone maps often included explicitly low-income areas and the communities right next to them. This means, according to the Times, that the program consistently funneled tax breaks to investment in already affluent or gentrifying areas, and or sped up gentrification in the economically depressed communities that needed the most help. Senator Scott still talks about Opportunity Zones as a win for the black community.
That's brought billions of dollars back in the poorest communities that have been left behind.
But the data says otherwise. The data shows that billionaires and corporations won, while low-income communities were robbed of the resources that tax dollars often fund. So corporate greed is thriving, all under the guise of a positive class and race-conscious initiative. This is a classic misdirection. Again, the role of the magical Negro is to help the white protagonist meet their goals, all while making sure that that protagonist's comfort and sense of nobility is undisturbed. In some ways, this character's presence alone is the misdirection. The magical Negro acts as a shield for the white protagonist, no matter how undeserving that character may be. I find it interesting that John Coffey must ingest the disease of the white person in order to free them from it. There is something sinister about this image that haunts. The idea that this awful thing must enter John Coffey, that he must become one with it, embrace something that could kill him for the sole purpose of saving the white people is messed up.
Good evening. I'm Senator Tim Scott from the great state of South Carolina. 100 years ago, kids in classrooms were taught the color of their skin was their most important characteristic. And if they looked a certain way, they were inferior. Today, kids are being taught that the color of their skin defines them again. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor. From colleges to corporations to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending we haven't made any progress at all, by doubling down on the divisions we've worked so hard to heal. You know this stuff is wrong. Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country. It's backwards to fight discrimination with different types of discrimination, and it's wrong to try to use our painful past to dishonestly shut down debates in the present. I'm an African American who's voted in the South my entire life. I take voting rights personally. Republicans support making it easier to vote and harder to cheat, and so do the voters. It will be easier to vote early in Georgia than in Democrat-run New York. But the left doesn't want you to know that. They want people virtue signaling. America has suffered because of slavery, but we've overcome that. We are the greatest nation on earth because we faced our demons in the mirror and made a decision. So often we think that all the issues, you talked about crime and education and healthcare, we always think that those issues go back to slavery. Here's the challenge though. Black families survived slavery. We survived poll taxes and literacy tests. We survived discrimination being woven into the laws of our country. Our nation continues to go in the right direction. It's why I can say I have been discriminated against, but America is not a racist country. Never, ever doubt who we are.
The signing of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And the Declaration, of course, talks at some length about the importance of the laws of nature and nature's God. I mean, it's like there's a ranking in the Declaration of Independence that God comes first, people come second, government comes last. We derive our freedom from the Lord, the Creator, and government derives whatever it has from us. Now, I think the Bidens rather have that backwards. But what I want to get to is your dramatic statement in your counter speech that America is not a racist country. It was the most wonderful thing for my ears, frankly, and I think you rallied hundreds of millions of people around the world with that. But this Declaration of Independence, I don't see where it says America is a racist country. I don't see where it says America is a bunch of white supremacists. This is like 5 or 6 pages, the Bill of Attainder against a despotic British monarch who took our rights away. But you can't be much clearer, can you? We are endowed by our Creator. It doesn't say some people. It says all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I'm trying to connect the dots to July 4th, the Declaration of Independence. By the way, Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, was written in 1776. Don't know if you knew that. And the framers loved it. This is not a racist country. This is a free country. This is an optimistic country. 100%. Tell me, talk to me. This is one of your greatest contributions. One of the things America needs to hear, Senator Scott.
Well, Larry, it's a simple concept. The concept is American progress. Can you see it? Is it tangible? If you look back over history, can you see racism, discrimination in a systemic system designed for the oppression of people? The answer is yes. Have we overcome that? Unequivocally, without doubt, assuredly, yes, emphatically, yes. The evolution, the arc towards justice consistently has been in the right direction. Every decade, things got better, not just for him, but for people all across this world, because white people and black people work together to bring to fruition this birth certificate that guaranteed life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for all Americans. It is a story of progress. Why we spend more time in the rearview mirror and less time in the windshield, I'll never understand. We should actually reverse that. We should spend most of our time in the present and the future, and only enough time in the rearview mirror to learn the lessons, not to repeat the past. But for us to pretend like this is somehow 1965 or 1921 or worse, 1865, is only to denigrate the progress, the pain, the misery, and the loss of lives that got us to a place where in 2010, I was elected to Congress in the birthplace of the Civil War. Or in 2008, this nation voted for President Obama.
With your words from your great speech, here's how you ended it. Quote, "So I am more than hopeful. I am confident that our finest hour is yet to come. Original sin is never the end of the story, not in our souls, not in our nation. The real story is always redemption."
Always.
Senator Tim Scott, we owe you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your spirit. Thank you for your trust in America, sir.
You need to leave history alone. Black history basically is how they were treated like by white people. That's basically what it is. Black American history is about black people being on by white people as they were trying to progress. Yeah, and you don't want to hear it, but we have to, because you still behave like that. You haven't changed. Now, I can understand if you've changed your attitude. You don't call us niggas anymore. You actually aren't passive aggressive. You stopped redlining. You stopped gentrifying what doesn't belong to you. You know, you stop actually defunding black schools, keeping black people in ghettos, mass incarceration. Let's say all of that stopped and there was no more of that. Then I would be like, hey, man, we need to stop complaining. We need to start treating them better. But it hasn't changed.
I'm pissed. Of the 4 black Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives, zero represent majority black districts.
I am royally pissed.
In fact, they all represent majority white districts, something they seem to be very proud of.
South Carolina is majority white, correct?
Yeah, it's Georgia.
My district is majority white district. Your Utah is majority white district, correct? Michigan, really. Florida, is your district majority white district? Well, how do we get here? Like, a lot of white people had to vote for it.
There is an obvious disconnect, and that's what I want to explore today. I wanted to know what draws a black person to identify with this Republican Party.
Trump has been for black people, regardless of what the media say, for a long time.
I learned a lot about black Republicans in these conversations. Their motivations, their stories, their goals. These are real people with genuinely held beliefs. Beliefs that I largely disagree with, and I told them as much.
It wasn't policy. It was white people.
Well, white people, it was
no. Let's be very clear. It was white people. No.
I tried to have respectful dialogue with them. I learned a lot about black Republicans, and I think you will too. So with that, let's dig in. In talking to black Republicans, I found that their most consistent ideological North Star was an emphasis on personal responsibility. For those I spoke to, there was a real value for rigid individualism as opposed to collective progress and identity. Take Topher, for example. He's a Christian rapper, has millions of followers online, and believes, according to him, in an individualistic approach to progress for black people.
And that's one reason why I'm pro-Trump and I'm a conservative, is because I truly believe in the individualistic approach to the problems that we see within the black community or in America. as a whole. And you can think about it, Black Wall Street, Harlem Renaissance, all that time, we was doing great. But when the policies came in and started destroying the black community slowly and slowly. Matter of fact, it was supposed to get rid of poverty or at least lessen it, but we have more poverty now than we had back then.
I think you'll notice a theme of dissonance present in these interviews. On the one hand, for example, Topher endorses an individualistic approach to solving the problems we face as a community. But on the other hand, he points to Black Wall Street or the Harlem Renaissance, communities that I would consider on the Mount Rushmore of Black collective power. And he points to them as times we should look back on with admiration. And the question is, which one is it? Is it rigid individualism where we get it out of the mud on our own? Or is it about creating communities where we work together to build our collective resources? What's also interesting is that somehow for him, these communities no longer exist because of liberal or progressive policy decisions.
But when the policies came in and started destroying the black community slowly and slowly. Matter of fact, it was supposed to get rid of poverty or at least lessen it, but we have more poverty now than we had back then.
I think it's worth pointing out that this more poverty now than back then line is verifiably false. It falls in line with a theme that people like Byron Donalds have advanced continuously throughout this election cycle. The idea that we were better off in any way during the Jim Crow era.
During Jim Crow, the black family was together.
Yeah, that's right.
During Jim Crow, more black people were not just conservative, because black people always have been conservative-minded, but more black people voted conservatively.
It's worth noting that the black poverty rate has been falling ever since black people started receiving civil rights protections. It's almost as if these progressive policies worked.
Now, you mentioned Black Wall Street, brother, and I want to be very real with you.
Yeah.
Black Wall Street was Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood District, where black people built their own community, had their own self-sustained community, beautiful economy, making it for themselves, and white people destroyed it.
Yeah.
It wasn't policy. It was white people.
Well, it wasn't white people. It was
no. Let's be very clear. It was white people.
No.
It
was those white people.
It was white people in that community. Absolutely.
Exactly.
And let me just say this: Elaine, Arkansas. Rosewood in Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, the Sweet Auburn District, North Nashville, and Nashville, Tennessee. Each one of these communities were booming black economies where white people, not in the same place, but it was the same group of people every time, destroyed those communities. So you can't say it's policy when when black people do what they need to do and build for themselves and white people destroy it. Yeah. So why is it that you would frame it as a policy thing?
I didn't frame it as a policy thing.
We can rewind it.
You said it was white people.
You mentioned.
I said it wasn't white people. It was those white people. And the reason why I'm saying that is because now we're trying to categorize all white people as evil.
No.
And what I'm trying to say is back then, because a lot of people don't know this, I'm gonna put this on record. Black Wall Street rebuilt themselves after that. 4 years after that, Black Wall Street rebuilt everything they had, and they prospered for the next 40 years until policy came in and destroyed it because they decided to build a freeway over their town, and that destroyed. So what I'm saying is, if we look at policy and the cultural essence of most things, right? It's not just policy, it's culture.
I was trying to draw a distinction between the nature of progressive policy, like the Civil Rights Act, or Supreme Court decisions to overturn segregation, and white supremacist policy, like destroying black communities. But the subject kept changing. Lucky for you, I actually made a video about Tulsa, Oklahoma's Greenwood District. It was definitely white racism that destroyed Black Wall Street and other black communities through explicitly racist acts of state-sanctioned violence. This is why an accurate, full telling of history is so important. Black oppression and black progress have always had a collective quality to them. Black people have been, throughout American history, targeted as a group, from slavery to black codes to Jim Crow to mass incarceration to anti-inclusion efforts today. But we've also made progress by harnessing the power of collective action during Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement, and even today during the black-owned business boom.
From LBJ, that's why you say we have these Negroes voting Democrat for the next 200 years. But all those policies have not done what they promised. Would you agree?
I would not agree.
So you think we're better off as black people now than we were before LBJ passed those policies?
Yes, brother, we can vote without the threat of violence. Are you talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Is that what you're describing as a negative thing?
I'm not saying the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was, I'm talking about...
That's LBJ, I just want to be clear. That's LBJ who you said, were we better off before LBJ? LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
I'm talking about the war on poverty.
I just want to answer that one. I want to answer that specific one first. Was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 bad thing?
I agree with the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Thank you.
But at the same time, I'm also put it like this. I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery.
I don't know what that means. Explain more.
What it means is I would rather, given the fact that even back then we still had our families together, communities were stronger back then, I would rather deal with the dangerous freedom of not knowing and controlling people with policies as much as possible versus the peaceful slavery of being married and tied to the government.
Given Trump's well-documented history of saying and doing racist things, I wanted to know how these black people could be drawn into Trump's political orbit. So I talked to Pastor Lorenzo Sewell.
Yeah, so anyone that wants to come to church, they're able to come. So when President Trump called, I thought about it like you calling me and say, hey, Pastor, I want to invite a friend to church who has 34 felonies. Hey, Pastor, I want to invite a friend to church who is a womanizer. Hey, Pastor, I want to invite a friend to church who could be a racist.
He's the lead pastor at a black church in Detroit that Trump visited earlier this year. And he was also a featured speaker at the RNC.
So all my friends back in Detroit who are Democrats, I want to ask you just one simple question. You can't deny the power of God on this man's life. You can't deny that God protected him. Could it be that Jesus Christ preserved him for such a time as this? Could it be?
Why should black people support the Republican ticket and Donald Trump specifically?
If a black person said, well, Pastor, Donald Trump is racist, the Republican Party is racist, well, let's play that theme out throughout history. Let's look at who was the party of slavery, who was the party of Jim Crow, right? Who was the party of the slave codes? Well, those are Democrats. Let's have that conversation. And when you look at when the Senate was integrated, those were black Republicans. When we look at Frederick Douglass, black Republican. So that's on the political side, why I believe that a black American should be willing to look at the Republican platform. Look at the Republican Party in terms of President Donald J. Trump. This is what I would say. Don't look at the container, look at the content, right? Don't look at the man, look at the mission, right? Don't look at his past. Look at what your agenda is for your community in the future.
Conservatives are leading the charge to remove protections for voting rights, protections for maternal mortality, interventions in California, affirmative action, diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are all issues that pertain directly to the people that I know that you serve in your community. Why should they support the party behind the hindrance, the advancement of the very things that I know you stand for?
Sure. Black people that I know, that I represent, that I've had these conversations with, they don't want to be put in a position because they're black. There's not one black person I know that will say to me, Lorenzo, I deserve this position because I'm black.
But I want to. You know that that's not what DEI is. DEI is about fair hiring practices, opening up opportunity, like creating pathways, like.
But you're smart. You're an intelligent man, and those that would say this, I believe they're very intelligent. It costs more money not to hire the person who's the best than to be racist. It actually costs more money. So if you're the best at what you do, right? And let's just say I'm a racist. So let's just say that, let's play that out, right? And let's just say, hey, there are 20 white guys that are not as competent as you, but I'm not gonna pick you because you're black. It's gonna cost me more money.
They don't even know that this qualified person exists. Right?
Sure, I hear you.
The pathways are the problem. And a lot of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is doing is creating those and helping to clarify those pathways. And so framing it as an unqualified person getting the job when we know, you and I both know, that there are plenty of qualified black people or Latino people or women who don't end up with jobs.
100%. And I agree with you. I do think relationships and proximity matter.
In his book, The Grift, Clay Cane details the history of how black conservatives have thrown black people under the bus to get ahead personally. From black Republicans like Isaiah Montgomery and Booker T. Washington to modern black Republicans like Clarence Thomas. Clay Cane makes the case that the modern black Republican is likely, if not assuredly, a grifter, a person who is doing that which is politically expedient rather than doing what is right, doing whatever they need to do to get that all expenses paid trip to fancy places. I couldn't help but wonder if some of the folks I was talking to fit that description. A relatively small percentage of black people will vote for Trump this November. My big concern with the future of the Republican Party. The RNC had quite a few drive-by acknowledgments that Black people exist, but little to no substantive action plans for how they would show up and be present with and for this community. And if I'm honest with you, I think that's on purpose. The only way the Republican Party becomes this ideologically conservative but racially inclusive big tent party is if there is a fundamental rejection of the people and policy and practice they currently hold as sacred, near and dear to their political vision. As long as the GOP makes racial justice a political issue worth fighting against, a majority of Black people will never vote for the party. As long as teaching Black history is woke, as long as race-conscious solutions to race-conscious problems are demonized, as long as they commit to denying racism's impact on society, Black people, by and large, are not going to vote for them. But these guys may, and that might be good enough for them.